Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to be talking about something that is so fundamental, so universal, that we almost never stop to think about how utterly different it once was. We're going to talk about children, specifically, what it was like to raise a child in the Middle Ages. It's a story of incredible resilience, of a kind of quiet, day-to-day grit that is almost impossible for us to comprehend from our modern world of creature comforts. And it's a story about a deep, profound love that existed in the face of staggering odds. It's a remarkable journey, and I'm glad we're taking it together. As always, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, a simple like, a subscribe, or a comment really does help this little channel find other people who enjoy this kind of quiet history. And for our community question, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. It's always so grounding to know that people all over the world are settling in to listen to these old stories. It makes the world feel a little smaller and a little cozier. But that's enough of all that. The past is waiting for us. So now is the time to do what you came here to do. Dim the lights. Adjust your pillow. Maybe pull the blanket up just a little bit higher. Get comfortable and let your body begin to unwind. Close your eyes and let's ease into our story together. Chapter 1. The Perilous Gate. Conception, Birth, and Infancy. To even begin the story of a medieval child, we have to start before them. We have to start with an act of hope, an act of faith, and an act that was, in the medieval mindset, absolutely saturated with spiritual significance. We have to start with conception. For us, conception is a matter of biology. It's about cycles, timing, and microscopic processes we can see under a lens. We have apps for it, clinics for it, a whole industry built around the science of creating life. For the medieval mind, it was a far more mysterious, and frankly, more cluttered affair. It was a potent cocktail of ancient medical theory, rigid church doctrine, and a thick layer of local folklore. The prevailing medical idea, inherited from Aristotle and the great physician Galen, was the theory of the seed. The man, it was believed, provided the seed. The active, life-giving principle, the woman provided the soil, the passive, nurturing vessel in which that seed would grow. It was a deeply patriarchal view of biology, one that cast the man as the spark of creation and the woman as the fertile field. Her contribution was vital, yes, but secondary. This wasn't just an abstract medical theory. It shaped everything. It meant that if a couple couldn't conceive, the fault was almost automatically laid at the woman's feet. Her soil, it was presumed, must be barren or cold or somehow inhospitable. On top of this, you had the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy body was a balanced one. Conception was thought to be most likely when the man and woman were both in a state of humoral balance and their heats were properly matched. A man was considered naturally hot and dry, a woman cold and moist. For a successful conception, these properties needed to find a harmonious equilibrium. It was all a delicate dance of unseen forces. A man who was too cold, or a woman who was too dry, might struggle to produce a child. The prescribed remedies were exactly what you'd expect. If you were too cold, you ate hot foods like peppers and red meat. Too moist, you ate dry foods. It was a form of cosmic cooking, an attempt to get the recipe for a human being just right. But the doctors and their humours were only one voice in the room. The loudest, most insistent voice was that of the church. The church had a lot of opinions on when, how, and why a couple should engage in the act of procreation. Forget romantic spontaneity. The medieval church provided what was essentially a spiritual scheduling app, and its main function was to tell you no. Sex was for one purpose, and one purpose only: to make more Christians. Any enjoyment derived from it was viewed with deep suspicion as a potential gateway to the sin of lust. To mitigate this spiritual danger, the act was hedged in with a truly staggering number of restrictions. You could not be together on Sundays, for that was the Lord's Day, nor on Wednesdays or Fridays, which were days of fasting and penance. You couldn't during Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, or during Advent, the weeks before Christmas, or during the feast days of major saints, of which there were many, or on the eve of receiving communion, or when a woman was pregnant, or when she was nursing, or during her monthly courses. When you actually tallied it all up, the number of permissible days in a year was shockingly small. One historian calculated that for a devout couple, there might be fewer than 60 days in the entire year when conception was even a theoretical, church-sanctioned possibility. It was less about finding a fertility window and more about finding a loophole in a very dense spiritual contract. And even on those rare permissible days, there were rules. The act had to be performed in the correct way, the so-called marital position, as anything else was deemed unnatural and sinful, an imitation of animal behavior that put the soul at risk. This wasn't just about morality, it was tied directly to the outcome. It was believed that a child conceived in sin, on a forbidden day, or in a forbidden way, could be born sickly or disabled, or even monstrous, a physical manifestation of the parent's transgression. The pressure to get it right, not just physically but spiritually, was immense. A healthy baby wasn't just a blessing, it was a sign that you had followed the rules. And then, layered beneath the scholarly doctors and the stern theologians, was the rich, earthy soil of folk belief. People turned to all sorts of remedies and rituals to encourage fertility. They would pray to specific saints, like Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, or Saint Gerard Majella. They would wear amulets, drink herbal concoctions, or visit holy wells and shrines believed to have life-giving powers. Some beliefs were charmingly specific. Eating the roasted womb of a hare was thought to help a barren woman. Others were based on sympathetic magic. Carrying a lodestone, a natural magnet, was thought to draw a child to the womb. For the couple trying to start a family, it was a world of competing anxieties. They were trying to balance their humours, appease their priest, and follow the old wisdom of the village all at the same time. And after all that, after navigating the labyrinth of spiritual and medical advice, if a woman's monthly courses ceased, a new period of waiting and uncertainty would begin. There were no pregnancy tests, no ultrasound scans. The first several months of a pregnancy were a period of profound ambiguity. The only signs were subtle, internal ones: the cessation of her period, a growing tiredness, perhaps a change in appetite. A formal declaration of pregnancy often wouldn't happen until the quickening, the first time the mother felt the fetus move within her. This was a moment of immense significance. In the eyes of the church and the community, this was the instant the soul entered the body. The fetus was no longer just a potential, it was a person. The pregnancy was real, and with that reality came a whole new set of anxieties. Pregnancy was a state of being that was considered profoundly vulnerable, a time when both mother and unborn child were susceptible to all manner of dangers, both physical and supernatural. The world, in the medieval view, was teeming with unseen forces, and a pregnant woman was like a beacon in the dark, attracting their attention. There was a pervasive fear of the evil eye, that a curse or a malicious glance from a jealous neighbour could harm the baby in the womb. To ward this off, a woman might carry charms like a piece of coral or a wolf's tooth tucked into her clothing. There was also the terrifying belief in changelings. It was thought that fairies or other malevolent spirits desired human babies and might sneak into a home to steal an unborn or newborn child, leaving a sickly, non-human replica in its place. This fear was a way of explaining birth defects, genetic disorders, or babies who were simply failure to thrive. A child who was colicky, or didn't grow properly, or had unusual features, might fall under the terrible suspicion of being a changeling. To protect her unborn child, a pregnant woman would avoid certain places, like crossroads or ancient ruins, especially at twilight, as these were thought to be portals to the fairy realm. Her diet was also a source of constant concern, guided not by nutritional science but by superstition and humoral theory. She was told to avoid certain foods that might mark the baby. If she had a sudden craving for strawberries and touched her face, it was feared the baby would be born with a red birthmark, a strawberry mark in that exact spot. She was also advised against eating rabbit, for fear the child would be born with a cleft lip. Life, of course, didn't stop. A peasant woman would continue her grueling work in the fields for as long as she was physically able. A noblewoman would continue to manage her vast and complex household, but everything was now done through the lens of her condition. She was in a liminal state, a sacred and perilous waiting period. Her every action, every meal, every encounter was weighed for its potential impact on the precious, unseen life within her, and hanging over it all was the very real, very rational fear of the birth itself. In an age without antibiotics, without anesthetics, without any real understanding of germ theory or surgical intervention, childbirth was the most dangerous thing a woman would ever do. It was often referred to as a woman's battle, her personal equivalent to the battlefield a man might face in war, and everyone knew someone, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, a mother, who had not survived it. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. A simple infection, a hemorrhage, a baby in the wrong position, Any of these could, and often did, prove fatal. So as the months wore on and her body changed, the pregnant woman was not just preparing for a new life, but also quite literally for a potential confrontation with her own death. She would be encouraged to make a full confession to the priest and put her spiritual affairs in order, just in case. It was a practical, grim acknowledgement of the stakes involved. When the first pains of labour began, the world of the expectant mother would shrink. It would shrink down to a single room, a space that was exclusively female territory. This was the birthing chamber, and no man was permitted to enter. Not the husband, not a brother, and certainly not a male physician. Male doctors, with their university training based on ancient texts, knew next to nothing about the practical realities of childbirth. This was the domain of women, passed down through generations of experience. At the centre of this world was the midwife. The midwife was one of the most respected and indispensable figures in any medieval community. She wasn't a formally trained medical professional in our sense. Her knowledge came from apprenticeship, from having attended countless births, and often from having had many children of her own. She was the obstetrician, the anesthesiologist, the doula, and the spiritual guide, all rolled into one. Her tools were not scalpels and forceps, but her hands, her knowledge of herbal remedies, and her vast reservoir of practical wisdom. When summoned, she would take charge of the birthing room. The first thing she would do is prepare the space. All the windows and doors would be sealed shut to keep out drafts, which were believed to cause illness. A large fire would be roaring in the hearth, both for warmth and to heat water. The room would be dimly lit, filled with the flickering shadows of candlelight and firelight. It would be crowded with other women from the family and the neighbourhood, the mother, sisters, cousins, trusted friends. This collective of women was known as the gossips, a word that originally just meant god-sibling or close companion, but which came to be associated with this circle of female support. They were there to pray, to offer encouragement, to hold the labouring mother, to wipe her brow, and to witness the event. The air in that room would have been thick and heavy, the smell of wood smoke from the fire, of sweat, of fear, of the herbal concoctions the midwife might be brewing to ease the pain or speed the labour. You would hear the low murmur of prayers, the encouraging whispers of the gossips, and above it all the rhythmic, gut-wrenching sounds of a woman in the throes of labour. Pain was not seen as something to be eliminated. It was understood as an unavoidable, integral part of the process, a biblical inheritance from the curse of Eve. The midwife's role wasn't to stop the pain, but to help the mother endure it. She might offer a drink of wine or strong ale. She might massage the mother's back with scented oils, or apply warm compresses to her belly. She would rely on a deep well of knowledge about positioning, encouraging the mother to walk around, to lean on her gossips, to kneel, to squat. The classic image of a woman lying flat on her back to give birth is a relatively modern invention. For most of history, women laboured upright, using gravity as an ally. The birthing stool, a sturdy, open-seated chair that allowed a woman to squat in a supported position, was a common piece of equipment. The midwife's primary skill was with her hands. She would know how to feel the baby's position in the womb, how to gauge the progress of the labour. She would know how to gently turn a baby who was presenting in a difficult position. This was a delicate, high-stakes art. One wrong move could be catastrophic. For hours, sometimes for days, this intense, female-centric drama would play out. The labouring mother was on a journey to a place her husband could never go, surrounded and supported only by other women who had made the journey themselves. But if things went wrong, the atmosphere of prayerful support could quickly turn to one of desperate crisis. A breech birth, where the baby is positioned to come out feet or bottom first, was incredibly dangerous. A baby getting stuck in the birth canal, a condition known as obstructed labour, was often a death sentence for both mother and child. A postpartum hemorrhage could drain a mother's life in minutes. In these terrifying moments, the midwife's experience was all that stood between life and death. She might try to manually extract the baby, a brutal and often devastating procedure. Her tools, if she had any, were simple hooks or blades, used only in the most dire of circumstances, often to dismember the fetus in the womb to save the mother's life. It's an almost unspeakably grim reality, but it was the last desperate option in a world without caesarean sections. If it became clear that the mother was dying, the protocol was clear and heartbreaking. The priest would be called. He would be the only man allowed to cross the threshold into the birthing chamber, and his purpose was not medical, but spiritual. He would administer the last rites. In the most extreme cases, if the mother died while the baby was still alive in the womb, The midwife or even the priest might perform a crude post-mortem caesarean section with a simple knife. This wasn't done to save the baby's life in a medical sense. They had no way to care for such a premature infant, but to baptize it before it died, saving its soul from the theological twilight zone of limbo. But let's step back from that precipice. In most cases, after an ordeal of pain and effort that we can barely imagine, a baby would be born. The midwife would be the one to cut the umbilical cord, often with a simple household knife, and tie it off with a piece of thread. She would then perform the first examination of the newborn, checking for deformities, clearing its airway, and giving it its first bath in a basin of warm water and wine, the alcohol believed to have cleansing properties. The first cry of a newborn in that smoky, crowded room was more than just a sound. It was a victory. It was a triumph over odds that were terribly, tragically high. It signalled that both mother and child had, for now, survived the perilous gate. But survival was a minute-by-minute proposition. The journey was far from over. In many ways it had just begun. The staggering reality of the Middle Ages is its infant mortality rate. We don't have precise statistics, of course, but historians estimate that anywhere from 20% to 30% of infants died within their first year. When you extend that to childhood, the numbers are even more stark. It's believed that in many parts of medieval Europe, as many as half of all children born would not live to see their 10th birthday. Think about that for a moment. Every family lived with an intimate, constant and personal knowledge of infant death. It wasn't an abstract tragedy that happened to other people. It was an expected part of life. Parents would have more children than they probably expected to raise to adulthood, a grim form of biological insurance. This constant presence of death is the key to understanding the single most urgent priority for a newborn infant, baptism. For us, baptism is a symbolic ceremony, a christening party with cake and presents. For the medieval family, it was an emergency spiritual procedure of the utmost importance. According to the theology of the time, an unbaptized soul could not enter heaven. If a baby died before the sacrament was administered, its soul was consigned to limbo, a state of perpetual natural happiness, but forever separated from the grace of God. For devout parents, this was a fate more terrifying than death itself. Consequently, there was a frantic rush to get a newborn to the church. This wasn't a ceremony planned for weeks in advance. It happened almost immediately, often within hours of the birth. A tiny, fragile newborn, just out of the womb, would be bundled up and carried through whatever weather was raging outside, a blizzard, a rainstorm, the biting wind, to the local parish church. The godparents, chosen long in advance, would be the ones to carry the child and speak for it at the font. If an infant was born weak or sickly, and it seemed unlikely to survive the trip to the church, the midwife was empowered to perform an emergency baptism herself. She would say the holy words, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," while pouring water over the baby's head. The phrase used in these situations was, "if you are alive," a poignant acknowledgement of the flickering nature of that new life. The midwife's spiritual responsibilities were just as heavy as her physical ones. She was not just a deliverer of bodies, but a guardian of souls. Once the child was baptized, a collective sigh of relief would have been felt by the entire family. Its eternal soul was secure. Now they just had to worry about its earthly survival. The first order of business was swaddling. For the first several months of its life, a medieval infant would spend nearly all its time tightly bound in linen or woolen strips, a practice known as swaddling. From our modern perspective, which emphasizes freedom of movement, tummy time, and motor skill development, this looks restrictive, even cruel. But in the medieval mindset, it made perfect sense. They believed that an infant's limbs were soft and pliable, like clay, and if left unbound, they would grow crooked. Swaddling was seen as a way to ensure the baby grew up straight and strong, a tiny human plank. There were other, more practical reasons too. A swaddled baby is a still baby. It can't scratch itself, it can't roll into a dangerous position, and it's much easier to manage. You could hang a swaddled baby from a peg on the wall, or lay it in a corner of the hut while the mother worked, with little fear of it getting into trouble. It turned the baby into a neat, portable, and easily storable package. The process itself was meticulous. The baby would be laid on a large piece of cloth. Its arms would be straightened at its sides, its legs straightened out together. Then long bands of cloth would be wrapped tightly around and around, from the shoulders down to the feet, until the infant was completely immobilized, like a tiny mummy. Often a second set of bands would be wrapped crisscross over the chest. Only the head was left free. Imagine the sensory world of that infant. It couldn't kick its legs or wave its hands or bring its fingers to its mouth. Its world was one of pressure, of warmth, of enforced stillness. It's a world so alien to our understanding of infant development that it's difficult to wrap our minds around. The baby would only be unswaddled a few times a day for cleaning, a process that was often cursory at best. Hygiene as we know it simply did not exist. Diapers were squares of linen or moss, changed infrequently. The swaddling bands themselves would become soiled and would be washed only occasionally. The constant dampness and lack of airflow led to agonizing skin rashes and sores. The life of a swaddled infant was often one of quiet, itchy, immobile discomfort. The next critical question for the newborn was food, and here, the path of a noble-born infant and a peasant infant diverged sharply. For the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, the mother would breastfeed her own child. It was practical, it was free, and it was the natural way. Maternal breastfeeding was the norm, but even this was fraught with a folk science of its own. It was believed that a mother's character, her emotions, and even her thoughts could be transmitted to the baby through her milk. If a mother was angry or frightened while nursing, it was thought her milk could be agitated and cause colic or illness in the infant. A mother's milk was seen as more than just nutrition. It was a transfer of essence. For the aristocracy and the wealthy merchant class, however, maternal breastfeeding was rare. It was considered, well, a bit animalistic. It was something peasants did. A noble lady's primary duty was not to nurse her infant, but to produce more heirs for her husband's lineage. Breastfeeding was known to have a contraceptive effect, delaying the return of a woman's fertility. To maximize the number of potential heirs, a noble woman needed to get pregnant again as quickly as possible, so the task of feeding the baby was outsourced. This is where the wet nurse comes in. A wet nurse was a woman, usually from a lower social class, who had recently given birth herself and was hired to breastfeed the baby of a wealthy family. Finding a good wet nurse was a matter of extreme importance. She would be scrutinized not just for the quality of her milk, but for the quality of her character. Since it was believed that milk transmitted personal traits, a noble family would go to great lengths to find a wet nurse who was placid, honest, and good-natured. A bad-tempered or immoral wet nurse, it was feared, could poison the child's character from the very start, turning a noble baby into a churlish adult. The life of the wet nurse was a strange one. She would often have to leave her own infant behind in the care of relatives, or feed it less nutritious animal milk, to give the best of her body to the child of her employer. The child she nursed would form a deep, primal bond with her, a bond that sometimes lasted a lifetime, but it also created a strange distance between the noble mother and her own child in those crucial early months. The child's first bond was not with its mother, but with a paid servant. When breastfeeding wasn't an option, for whatever reason, the alternatives were grim. The most common was animal milk, typically from a goat or a cow, which is difficult for human infants to digest, and the delivery system was a breeding ground for bacteria. Forget sterilized plastic bottles. A medieval baby might be fed from a hollowed-out cow's horn with a piece of cloth stuffed in the end to act as a nipple, or from a sucking pot, a small earthenware vessel with a spout. None of these things could be properly cleaned. They would be rinsed out at best. The risk of contracting a fatal gastrointestinal illness from contaminated milk or a dirty feeding vessel was astronomically high. For an infant, a simple case of diarrhea could easily lead to dehydration and death within a day or two. This is one of the single biggest reasons why infant mortality was so high. The world was a microbial minefield, and a baby's immune system was no match for it. The daily life of the infant was a cycle of being swaddled, fed, and cleaned, all within the confines of a small, dark, and often smoky peasant hut, or a draughty, vast chamber in a castle. Cradles were common, simple wooden boxes that could be rocked. The gentle, repetitive motion was one of the few comforts an infant might know. Co-sleeping was also the norm. The entire family, and in poorer households, sometimes even the livestock, would huddle together for warmth during the cold nights. A baby would sleep pressed between its parents or siblings. While this provided warmth and comfort, it also came with its own terrible risk, accidental suffocation, or overlaying as it was called. It was common enough that church manuals often warned parents against it. An infant's world was sensorially intense. It was a world of scratchy wool and coarse linen against the skin, a world of smells, the ever-present wood smoke, the smell of unwashed bodies, of cooking food, of damp earth on the floor of a peasant hut. and the pungent, close smell of livestock. It was a world of sounds, the crackling of the fire, the wind howling outside the wattle and daub walls, the low murmur of voices, the sounds of animals. And in this world, love and loss were woven together so tightly they were almost indistinguishable. The modern idea that medieval parents were emotionally detached from their children because of the high mortality rates is a profound misunderstanding. The grief was real, and it was deep. We have letters, poems, and funerary art that attest to the heart-wrenching pain of losing a child, but it was a grief that had to be lived with, a grief that was common to everyone. It didn't make parents love their children less. It just meant that their love was always shadowed by a terrible fragility. Every infant who survived the perilous gate of birth, who made it through the first critical weeks, who endured the swaddling bands and survived the precariousness of their milk, was a small miracle. They had passed through the first and most dangerous filter of medieval life. They had survived their own beginning, but the challenges were far from over. The journey from a swaddled, helpless infant to a functioning member of medieval society was a long and uncertain road, and the next stages would bring their own unique set of dangers and expectations. For now, our tiny survivor lies sleeping in a cradle by the fire, a small breathing testament to hope in a world that offered very little of it, and in that quiet moment, we can leave them to their rest. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The world of small things, play, labour, and the concept of childhood. But of course, they don't get to rest for long. No one does. Sleep is a necessity, a brief reprieve, but the world doesn't stop for it. The fire in the hearth will die down, the morning chill will creep back in, and the sounds of the world waking up, a cock crowing, the lowing of a cow, the clatter of a wooden bucket will call our little survivor back from the oblivion of sleep. And as their eyes flutter open, what kind of world do they open to? This is where we have to ask ourselves a very fundamental and surprisingly tricky question. When that child wakes up, are they waking up to a childhood? It seems like an absurd question, doesn't it? Of course they are. They are a child. What else would they be having? But the concept of childhood, as we know it, is a relatively modern invention. The idea of a protected, cherished, and distinct phase of life dedicated to play, learning, and emotional development, cordoned off from the harsh realities of adult work and responsibility, that was a luxury few could afford, and even fewer could conceive of. For a long time, a popular theory among historians, most famously put forward by a scholar named Perilous, was that the Middle Ages simply had no concept of childhood at all. Once a child was past the initial perilous years of infancy, once they could walk, talk, and not immediately put a poisonous mushroom in their mouth, they were essentially just a small, less competent adult. They were integrated into the adult world as quickly as possible, dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, and expected to contribute. The art of the period seems to support this. If you look at medieval manuscripts and paintings, children are often depicted with the faces and proportions of grown-ups, just scaled down. They have the same serious, sombre expressions, the same knowing eyes. It's a bit unsettling, like looking at a boardroom meeting attended by people who are all 3 feet tall. This theory suggests a world without sentimentality, a world where the line between adult and child was blurry to the point of being non-existent. And while there's a grain of truth to it, as there often is with these sweeping historical statements, the reality is, as always, so much more complicated and frankly more human. Medieval people weren't unfeeling robots. They knew the difference between a 7-year-old and a 27-year-old. They recognized that children were physically weaker, less knowledgeable, and more vulnerable. Legal codes from the time reflect this. They often specified an age of reason, typically around 7, and later an age of legal majority, around 12 or 14, before which a person couldn't be held fully accountable for their crimes in the same way as an adult. They understood that children needed to be taught and disciplined differently. What they lacked wasn't an awareness of youth, but our modern, romanticized cult of childhood. They didn't see childhood as an idyllic garden to be sheltered from the world. They saw it as an apprenticeship, a training ground. The world was a hard, unforgiving place, and the primary job of childhood was to prepare you to survive it, to delay that preparation, to coddle a child and shield them from the realities of work, hunger, and responsibility wasn't seen as kindness. It was seen as a profound and potentially fatal disservice. So let's step back into that one-room peasant hut. Our infant has survived the night. They are unswaddled, and as the months turn into years, they begin to crawl, then toddle, then walk. The world for them is the floor, and the floor of a medieval peasant's house is not something you'd want to feature in a real estate brochure. There are no polished hardwoods or cozy carpets here. The floor is packed earth. It's dirt, and it's not clean dirt. It's a surface that has absorbed generations of spilled food, tracked in mud, animal droppings, and who knows what else. It's cold, it's damp, and it is the entire universe for a toddler. This is their playground. The leg of a stool is a mountain to be climbed. A stray chicken wandering in through the ever-open door is a fascinating pecking monster to be chased or fled from. The sputtering, mesmerizing fire in the central hearth is a source of warmth and light, but also a constant mortal danger that they must learn to respect with a speed that modern parents with their padded corners and baby gates can hardly imagine. There was no baby-proofing the medieval home. The home itself was the hazard. The child either learnt the rules of survival: don't touch the fire, don't fall in the well, don't get under the hooves of the cow that might be sharing your living quarters in the winter, or they didn't make it to the next stage. It was a brutal but brutally effective curriculum. For the first few years, up to that age of reason around 7, a child's life was a strange mix of neglect and freedom. Their parents were consumed by the back-breaking labour needed to stay alive. There was no time for structured play, no tummy time on a colourful mat, no singing of educational songs. Children were often left to their own devices, watched over by a slightly older sibling who was only marginally more responsible than they were. They tumbled about in the dirt, forming little gangs of grubby, half-naked toddlers, exploring their tiny world with a freedom that is almost unimaginable today. Imagine it. A modern child's day is often scheduled down to the minute. School, soccer practice, piano lessons, supervised playdates. A medieval peasant child had a schedule that consisted of one item: don't die. Beyond that, the hours were their own. They could wander the village, poke sticks into anthills, splash in the stream, a stream that was also the village sewer, but let's not dwell on that, and learn about the world through direct, unfiltered experience. They learned which berries were sweet, and which would make your stomach cramp. They learned how to get close to a rabbit before it bolted. They learned the complex social hierarchy of the village dogs. It was a world of profound sensory input. The constant smell of wood smoke, manure, and damp earth, the feel of rough-spun wool against their skin, the squelch of mud between their toes, the taste of a wild onion pulled straight from the ground, the sound of the wind whipping across an open field, uninterrupted by the hum of traffic. This was their education. They weren't learning to read or write. They were learning to read the world. They were learning the fundamentals of the only life they would ever know. And they did play. It's one of the most fundamental human instincts. No matter how grim the circumstances, children will find a way to play, but their toys and games were a reflection of their world, simple, practical, and often handmade from whatever was lying around. Don't picture a medieval Toys R Us. There were no brightly coloured plastic objects manufactured in a distant factory. A toy was a special, often unique thing. A father, after a long day in the fields, might sit by the fire and carve a rough approximation of a horse or a soldier from a block of wood. It wouldn't be perfect. It would be chunky, splintery, and probably lopsided. But to a child who had nothing, it was a treasure. It was a piece of the adult world, shrunk down to their size. A tiny wooden sword, a doll made from a bundle of rags with a face drawn on in charcoal. Archaeologists occasionally unearth these humble treasures, tiny clay pots and jugs, made by a child mimicking their mother at her pottery wheel, polished animal knuckle bones, used for a game similar to modern jacks, tossed and caught in complex sequences, smooth, flat stones for skipping across a pond. These weren't educational toys in the modern sense, designed to improve motor skills or teach colour recognition. Their purpose was far more direct. They were practice. A boy playing with a little wooden knight wasn't just having fun. He was play-acting the social structure that governed his entire existence. He was the lord, the knight, the vassal. He was learning the language of power and violence that was the bedrock of his society, even if he himself would never wield a real sword. A girl cradling a rag doll wasn't just playing house. She was practicing the one and only role society had prepared for her, that of a mother. She was learning to nurture, to swaddle, to care for a smaller being, rehearsing for the day she would be handed a real screaming infant of her own. Games were often group activities, played in the village common or the churchyard. Games like blind man's buff, tag, or a primitive form of soccer, played with an inflated pig's bladder. These games were chaotic, rough, and largely unsupervised. They taught children how to navigate social dynamics, how to cooperate, how to compete, how to be a graceful winner, and more often, a sore loser. They learnt about cruelty and kindness, about who was a leader and who was a follower. It was a microcosm of the adult society they were destined to join. The same toughs who would one day dominate the village tavern were probably the ones who dominated the pig's bladder game as children. But this brief window of relative freedom, this time of play and exploration, was short-lived. It came to an abrupt end around the age of 7. This wasn't because of a birthday party with a cake and presents. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. The child was now deemed to have reason. They could understand instruction. They could be held responsible for their actions. And most importantly, they could work. And so, labour began. It started small. The tasks were fitted to their size and strength. A 7-year-old girl might be tasked with helping her mother spin wool, a tedious, repetitive job that required nimble fingers, or she'd be sent to watch the geese, to make sure they didn't wander into the Lord's freshly planted field, a mistake that could get her family fined or even evicted. A boy might be sent into the fields to be a living scarecrow, shouting and clapping his hands all day to keep the crows from eating the precious seeds. It was a job of immense importance, but it was also mind-numbingly boring and lonely. Imagine standing in a vast empty field from sunup to sundown, your only companions the wind and the birds you were supposed to be scaring. There's no smartphone, no book, no friend to talk to, just hours upon hours of solitude and responsibility. If you doze off, if you get distracted and let the birds feast, your family might not have enough bread to survive the winter. That's a heavy weight to place on the shoulders of a 7-year-old. As they grew older, the tasks became more demanding. A girl would graduate from spinning to weaving, from watching geese to milking the cow, from fetching water to learning how to bake bread and brew the weak, watery ale that was the staple drink for everyone, including children. A boy would move from scaring birds to weeding the fields, then to helping his father with the plough, guiding the heavy oxen through the dense, resistant soil. Every task was a lesson. There was no school but the field, the forest and the home. Your father was your teacher, your mother your guide. The curriculum was survival. Play didn't vanish entirely, but it was relegated to the shrinking slivers of daylight left after the work was done, or to the holy days and festivals that punctuated the relentless rhythm of the agricultural year. It became a luxury, a brief moment of levity, in a life that was increasingly defined by hard physical labour. This was the reality for the vast majority of children, the children of peasants, serfs and simple craftsmen. But if you were lucky enough to be born into the nobility, your childhood was a very different story. It was still an apprenticeship, but for a completely different kind of life. A noble child's world was not one of dirt floors and foraging for berries. It was a world of cold stone castles, tapestries on the walls, and a level of material comfort that a peasant child could not even comprehend. They had better food, warmer clothes, and were shielded from the raw daily struggle for subsistence. But don't mistake comfort for a lack of pressure. The expectations placed on a noble child were, in their own way, just as crushing as those on a peasant. A peasant boy was expected to become a good farmer. A noble boy was expected to become a warrior, a ruler, a link in a chain of lineage that might stretch back for centuries. The future of his entire family, his name, his lands, rested on his small shoulders. The concept of play in a noble household was far more structured and purposeful. The toys were of a different calibre altogether. A young lord wouldn't get a lopsided wooden horse. He might get a beautifully carved and painted rocking horse, complete with a leather saddle. He wouldn't just have a wooden stick for a sword. He'd have a scaled-down, blunted metal sword and a small shield, perfect for practicing his stances. Archaeological digs have found exquisite miniature pewter knights and entire sets of toy soldiers, suggesting that a young noble's bedroom floor might have looked like a tiny, intricate battlefield. These weren't just for amusement. They were training simulators. The toy soldiers taught him strategy. The mock sword taught him the feel of a weapon in his hand. Everything was geared towards his future role as a military commander and a master of men. A noble girl's toys were similarly geared towards her destiny. She would have dolls, but these were not simple rag bundles. They might be elaborate creations of wood or wax, with real hair and intricate hand-sewn wardrobes that mirrored the latest court fashions. Playing with these dolls was a lesson in dress and etiquette. She learned how to manage a household by playing with miniature furniture and pewter dishes. Her world was a domestic one, and her play was a rehearsal for managing a vast and complex castle household, overseeing servants, and being a fitting wife for a powerful lord. Formal education was another major difference. While the peasant child learned to read the seasons, the noble child learned to read books. From a young age, a tutor, usually a local priest or a clerk, would be brought in to teach them their letters. For a boy, this was crucial. He needed to be able to read and understand treaties, land grants, and letters from his king. Latin, the universal language of the church and of law, was a must. He would also be taught numbers, enough to manage his estate's finances and not get cheated by his steward. But his most important education took place outside the schoolroom. Around the age of 7 or 8, a noble boy would often be sent away from home. This seems cruel to us, but it was a vital part of his upbringing. He would go to the castle of a more powerful lord, or even to the royal court, to serve as a page. Life as a page was a strange combination of being a servant and a student. He would serve the lord and lady at their table, learning manners and courtly etiquette. He would run messages, care for the lord's clothes, and make himself useful in 100 small ways. But he was also being watched and educated. He would learn the arts of war firsthand. He'd be taught to ride a warhorse, not just a pony. He'd practice with the lance, the sword, and the bow, training alongside other boys of his station. He was learning how to fight, but just as importantly, he was learning the code of chivalry, the complex set of rules governing how a knight was supposed to behave. He was building a network of connections with the other boys who would one day be his allies or his enemies on the battlefield. For a noble girl, education was focused on the skills she would need to be a desirable bride and an effective chatelaine, the lady of the castle. She would learn to read, often in the vernacular language rather than Latin, and perhaps to write. Her studies would include music, singing, and dancing, all essential social graces for the court. But her primary education was in the domestic arts, albeit on a grand scale. She would learn needlework and embroidery, creating vast, complex tapestries. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a display of her patience, artistry, and breeding. She learned how to manage supplies, how to direct a small army of servants in the kitchens, the laundry, and the stables. She might learn about herbal remedies to tend to the sick in her household. She was being trained to be the CEO of a major domestic and economic enterprise, the castle. Her childhood, too, would end abruptly. While a peasant girl might marry in her late teens, a noble girl could be betrothed as a toddler and married as young as 12. Her marriage was not a matter of love, it was a strategic alliance, a treaty between two families, sealed with her person. Her value lay in her lineage, the lands she brought with her as a dowry, and her potential to produce a male heir. It was a life of privilege, yes, but it was also a life inside a gilded cage, with her path determined for her from the moment she was born. So we have these two parallel tracks of childhood, running side by side but worlds apart. The peasant child granted a brief wild freedom before being absorbed into a life of relentless toil, and the noble child, wrapped in fine clothes and living in a stone fortress, but shackled from birth by the heavy chains of duty and expectation. But what they had in common was this fundamental idea: childhood was not the destination, it was the journey. It was the period in which you were forged into the tool you were meant to be. For 99% of the population, that tool was a farm implement, a pair of hands to pull a plough or spin a thread. For the 1%, it was a weapon, a diplomat, a vessel for a bloodline. The games they played, the songs they sang, the chores they did, all of it was a form of socialization, a constant, gentle, and sometimes not so gentle, pressure shaping them to fit perfectly into the niche that society had carved out for them. Let's look at the gender roles, which were hammered home from the earliest age. Boys' games were almost always about outward action, about competition and physical prowess. They wrestled, they raced, they played games that mimicked fighting or hunting. Even a simple game like King of the Hill was a bald-faced lesson in dominance and hierarchy. The goal was to climb to the top and violently repel all challengers. It's not a subtle metaphor. From his first wooden sword to his training as a page, a boy was taught that his sphere was the world outside, the field, the battlefield, the court. His role was to be active, to command, to protect, and to provide. Girls' games, by contrast, were largely about the inward domestic sphere, playing with dolls, setting up a make-believe house, mimicking the act of cooking or caring for an infant. Their play was about nurturing, about social relationships, about creating and maintaining a stable home environment. They learned to cooperate, to gossip, to manage the intricate social politics of the female world. From her first rag doll to her embroidery lessons, a girl was taught that her place was within the home, her power was in her ability to manage the domestic sphere and to produce the next generation. These weren't just suggestions, they were ironclad rules for living, and play was the most effective way to teach them, because the children absorbed the lessons without even realizing it. They were just having fun, but all the while society was whispering in their ear, "This is who you are, this is what you will do, there are no other options." And social hierarchy was baked into their play as well. Even among a group of peasant children, a natural order would emerge. The children of the village, reeve, or a prosperous craftsman might assume leadership roles, simply because they were mimicking what they saw their parents do. Among noble children, it was even more explicit. A young duke would always outrank a young baron, even in a game of tag. The deference and respect for social standing were learned on the playground, long before they were practiced in the throne room. Play was also a way of processing the often frightening adult world. In a time of frequent warfare, it's no surprise that boys' favourite games involved mock battles. It was a way of taming their fear, of turning the terrifying clash of steel they might hear about in stories, or even witness firsthand, into a manageable, controlled activity. They were taking the chaos of the adult world and putting it into a box they could understand. But we must be careful not to over-romanticize this period of play. Brief as it was, a medieval village was a small, insular community. There was little privacy and few secrets. A child's life was lived in public, and with that came a certain level of community responsibility, but also a potential for communal cruelty. Bullying was not a concept that would have been understood. It was just the natural friction of life, the strong dominating the weak. A child who was different, physically weak, slow-witted, or from a family that was disliked, would have had a very difficult time. There were no guidance counselors or anti-bullying campaigns. Survival of the fittest wasn't just a biological principle, it was a social one, and it started in the muddy playing fields of the village green. As we dig deeper, we find that the line between play and labour was often incredibly blurry. Was a young boy helping his father fletch arrows for a hunt, working, or playing? To him, it might have felt like a game, a fun way to spend time with his father and handle interesting objects. But to his father, it was essential labour, preparing the tools needed to put food on the table. Was a girl sent to forage for mushrooms and wild herbs in the woods, working or playing? It might have been an adventure for her, a chance to be out in nature, but the herbs she brought back were a vital part of the family's diet and medicine cabinet. Perhaps the best way to understand it is that for a medieval child, all of life was an education, and all of it was work in a sense. There was no clear division between the classroom, the playground, and the workplace. They were all the same place. You learnt by watching, you practiced through play, and you perfected your skills through labour. This seamless integration of a child into the economic life of the family is perhaps the biggest difference between their world and ours. Today, we see child labour as an evil to be eradicated. In the Middle Ages, child labour wasn't just accepted, it was the entire point of having children. In a world without social security or retirement plans, your children were your future. They were the ones who would care for you in your old age, if you were lucky enough to reach it. They were an extra pair of hands to help with the harvest, an extra mouth to feed. Yes, but also a vital economic asset. A large family was a wealthy family, not in terms of gold, but in terms of labour power. And so the years would pass. The small chores would become larger ones. The 7-year-old bird scarer becomes the 12-year-old ploughboy. The 10-year-old girl spinning wool becomes the 15-year-old who can manage a hearth, bake bread, and mind her younger siblings all at once. The boundary between childhood and adulthood wasn't a single sharp line, but a slow creeping tide that gradually washed away the shores of play and freedom, leaving behind the solid, unyielding bedrock of responsibility. For many, what we would consider childhood was over by the age of 12 or 14. A boy might be formally apprenticed to a craftsman in a town, leaving his family behind to learn a trade. A girl might be married, sent to a new home to be a wife, and soon after, a mother. They were legally adults, expected to perform adult roles. Even though their bodies and minds might not have been fully ready, there was no teenage phase, no period of rebellion or self-discovery. The path was laid out for them, and their job was to walk it. So, did the Middle Ages have a concept of childhood? Yes, they did. They saw it as a distinct and necessary stage of life, but they defined it in their own terms, shaped by the harsh realities of their world. It was not a time of innocence, but of preparation. Not a time of protected play, but of integrated, purposeful labor. It was a brief, precious, and often dangerous runway from which a person was launched into the unforgiving sky of adult life. The world of small things, of rough wooden toys, of secret dens in the woods, of games played with pebbles and pigs' bladders, was a real and vital part of medieval life. It was the training ground, the simulator, the schoolhouse for a world that demanded competence from a very young age. Our little survivor, crawling on the dirt floor of that hut, was not seen as a miniature adult, but as an adult in training. Every game they played, every task they were given, was another lesson in the single, all-important subject of their curriculum, how to endure. And as they grew, the world of small things would slowly fade, replaced by the world of heavy things, the plough, the sword, the burdens of family, and the ceaseless grinding work of staying alive. The game was over. Real life had begun. Chapter 3. Forging a Future, Education, Apprenticeship, and Finding a Place. And so, real life had begun. But what precisely was that life meant to be? For us, that question is a universe of possibilities, a source of late-night anxiety and endless hopeful daydreaming. What will you become? A doctor? An artist? An engineer? The question implies choice. It implies a future that is a blank page, waiting for you to write your own story. For that child who had just survived the perilous gauntlet of their early years, that question was, in most cases, already answered. The page was not blank. It was written, stamped, and sealed by the circumstances of their birth. The great project of their youth was not to discover who they were, but to learn how to be what they already were, dictated by the unyielding architecture of the medieval world. Their future was not a path to be chosen, but a slot to be filled, and the process of fitting them into that slot, of forging them into the correct shape, was what passed for education. Let's begin where most lives began and ended, on the land. For the vast, overwhelming majority of children, perhaps 90% or more, the classroom had no walls, the teacher carried no book, and the curriculum was written in mud and sunlight. A peasant child's education was a long, slow, and entirely practical apprenticeship in the art of survival. Their school was the field, the forest, the byre. Their lessons were the rhythm of the seasons, the moods of the livestock, the heft of an axe, the feel of the soil. There was no formal instruction in the way we would recognize it. No one sat a group of 7-year-olds down and explained the theory of crop rotation. Instead, the child learned by watching, and then by doing. The first tasks were simple, scaring crows from the new-sown field. It sounds like a game, but it was a vital job. The difference between a full belly and a hungry winter. They would wander the fields with a wooden clapper, a small, important guardian of the family's future. They learned to gather firewood, not just any wood, but the right kind, dry, seasoned, not green wood, that would fill their tiny, smoke-filled hut with even more blinding soot. They learned which berries were a sweet treat, and which were a quick trip to the afterlife. They learned to read the sky for rain, not from a weather app, but from the colour of the clouds and the behaviour of the birds. As their small hands grew stronger, the tasks grew heavier. They would help with the weeding, a back-breaking, endless task. They would lead the oxen, a slow and patient partnership with a beast of immense power. A boy would learn from his father the precise rhythmic swing of the scythe, a tool that was both a source of life and a wickedly dangerous instrument. To use it badly was to waste precious grain, or worse, to slice open your own leg far from any hope of help. A girl would learn from her mother the 1,000 intricate skills of the domestic world, how to milk a goat without getting kicked, how to churn butter, how to preserve vegetables for the winter, how to spin wool into thread, a constant near-magical transformation of a shaggy fleece into the very fabric that kept them from freezing to death. This was not an education for intellectual curiosity, it was an education in competence. The final exam was graded on a simple pass-fail basis. You lived or you died. Every lesson was practical, immediate and essential. There was no room for abstract thought when the harvest was rotting in the fields, or a wolf was circling the flock. Their minds were being shaped not to ask why, but to know how to fix a broken fence, how to spot sickness in a sheep, how to make a fire with damp wood, how to stretch a handful of flour into a meal for 6. Their diploma was another sunrise. For a tiny, infinitesimally small fraction of these children, however, another path could, on rare occasion, present itself. It was a path that led away from the mud and the toil, a path into a world of stone, incense, and the written word. This was the path of the church. If a local priest noticed a village boy who was particularly sharp, or if a family was pious or perhaps desperate enough, they might offer their son to the church as an oblate. It was in many ways the medieval equivalent of winning a scholarship to a prestigious boarding school. It was a ticket out, but the price of that ticket was everything you knew. You would leave your family, your village, your name, and your future to be reborn as a servant of God. The education this boy would receive was so profoundly different from that of his farm-bound cousins that it might as well have been happening on another planet. He would enter a monastery or a cathedral school, and the first thing he would have to learn was a new language, Latin. This was the language of God, of the law, of all serious knowledge. It was the operating system of the medieval intellectual world, and you couldn't do anything without it. The learning was brutal and relentless. Forget gentle encouragement and interactive lessons. The primary teaching tool was rote memorization, backed up by the ever-present threat of the ferula, a wooden rod or paddle used to beat discipline into the palms of inattentive students. The boy would spend hours, days, weeks chanting declensions and conjugations, his voice echoing in a stone-walled room so cold he could see his breath. The goal was to beat Latin into him so thoroughly that it became second nature. Once he had a grasp of the language, he would begin his journey through what were known as the 7 liberal arts. This was the pinnacle of formal education. It began with the trivium, the 3 roads of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Grammar taught him the structure of language itself, how to read and write the holy texts correctly. Logic, or dialectic, was the art of reasoning, of building an argument and tearing an opponent's down, an essential skill for theological debate. Rhetoric was the art of persuasion, of speaking beautifully and convincingly, a tool for future sermons. If he mastered the trivium, he might move on to the quadrivium, the 4 roads of more advanced study: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But these subjects were not quite what we imagine. Arithmetic was less about practical calculation, and more about understanding the mystical properties of numbers as they appeared in the scriptures. Geometry was not for building bridges, but for appreciating the divine proportions of God's creation. Music was the study of harmony, the mathematical relationships between notes that echoed the harmony of the heavens, and astronomy was the study of the celestial spheres, the majestic clockwork universe that God had set in motion. It was a worldview so deeply ingrained with theology that it's hard for us to grasp. Science, art, and religion were not separate subjects. They were all different ways of studying the mind of God. The entire universe was a single, unified text, and these boys were being taught how to read it. Life in these schools was austere beyond our comprehension. Students or novices would wake before dawn for prayers, their days a rigid cycle of worship, chores, and study. The food was meagre, the comforts non-existent. Forget about a heated classroom. The only warmth came from the press of bodies and the fire in their bellies to succeed. This was a mental forge, designed to hammer a boy into a scholar, a clerk, a priest, a cog in the vast intellectual and administrative machine of the church. It was an escape from the plough, yes, but it was an escape into a different kind of servitude, a life of discipline, celibacy, and obedience. He had traded the tyranny of the seasons for the tyranny of the bell, which tolled to mark every hour of his highly structured day. Now, between the world of the farmer and the world of the clerk, a new world was beginning to flourish, particularly as the Middle Ages wore on. This was the world of the town, the world of the craftsman, the merchant, the artisan, and for the children of this burgeoning urban class, education was once again a different beast entirely. This was the world of the apprenticeship. Apprenticeship was the dominant form of job training for centuries, a formalized, legally binding system that was part trade school, part indentured servitude, and part adoption. It was the medieval version of a professional internship, only it lasted for the better part of your childhood, and you rarely got weekends off. It began early. A child, usually a boy but sometimes a girl, could be apprenticed as young as 7, though 10 to 14 was more common. Let's imagine a boy, the son of a moderately successful baker in a growing town. His father knows that the family trade is a good one, but to ensure his son's future, he needs him to become a master baker himself, recognized by the powerful Bakers' Guild. He can't just teach the boy on the side. The guild has rules. The boy must be properly apprenticed. The father would find a reputable master baker, perhaps a friend or a man known for his skill, and a formal contract, an indenture would be drawn up. This was a serious legal document. It would be written in duplicate on a single sheet of parchment, and then torn or cut in a jagged, indented line, hence the name indenture. Each party kept one half, and the only way to prove the document's authenticity was to see if the two halves perfectly matched. This contract was a monumental trade-off. The father would pay the master a fee, sometimes a significant sum. In exchange, the master agreed to take the boy into his home for a set number of years, typically 7, but it could be as long as 10 or even 12. The master pledged to teach the boy the art and mystery of his trade. That word mystery is key. It didn't just mean a skill, it meant the secret knowledge of the craft, the jealously guarded techniques that set a guild member apart from a common hack. The master also agreed to provide food, lodging and clothing, and to act as a surrogate father, responsible for the boy's moral and spiritual well-being. In return, the boy pledged his obedience, his labor, and his loyalty. He was forbidden from marrying, gambling, or frequenting taverns. He could not leave the master's service. For the next 7 to 12 years, every moment of his waking life belonged to the master. He had effectively signed away his childhood. Life for the new apprentice was an immediate and brutal shock. He was now the lowest-ranking member of a new household. His bed was likely a straw pallet under a workshop counter, or in a cold attic with 3 other apprentices. He would be woken hours before dawn. His first duties had nothing to do with the art and mystery of baking. He would sweep the floors, fetch water from the town well, carry sacks of flour that were almost as heavy as he was, tend the fire, scrub the kneading troughs, and run errands. He was the workshop's gopher, its cleaning crew, and its general dog's body. The master's wife was just as much his boss as the master. She would task him with household chores, from cleaning the privy to helping in the kitchen. He was, in essence, a domestic servant as well as a trade learner. The other older apprentices who had endured this same treatment would now take great pleasure in ordering him around, passing down the most unpleasant tasks with a grim satisfaction. It was a rigid, often cruel, hierarchy. Learning was a slow process of osmosis. For the first year, he might not be allowed to touch the dough at all. He would just watch. He would learn by seeing, by smelling, by listening. He learned the feel of a good dough, not from a recipe book, those didn't exist for his trade, but by watching the master's hands, by the sound it made when slapped on the table, by the way it sprang back. He learned to control the heat of the oven, not with a thermostat, but by the colour of the stones and the feel of the air on his face. This was a sensory, intuitive education, passed down from master to apprentice over generations. Discipline was harsh and physical. A mistake, burning a batch of bread, spilling precious ingredients, would be met with a swift clout to the ear or a beating. This wasn't seen as abuse. It was considered a necessary part of the educational process. The contract often explicitly gave the master the right to chastise his apprentice. He was shaping the boy not just into a baker, but into a disciplined and obedient member of the guild. The guilds themselves were fantastically powerful institutions. They were a combination of a modern-day trade union, a professional regulatory body, an oligopoly, and a social club. The Weavers' Guild, the Goldsmiths' Guild, the Fishmongers' Guild. They controlled every aspect of their respective trades within a town. They set prices, dictated quality standards, and determined who was allowed to practice the craft. You couldn't just open up a shop. You had to be a master, approved by the guild, and the only way to become a master was to first be an apprentice. The system was designed to limit competition and maintain a monopoly on skill. It created a clear, if arduous, career path. After his 7 or 10 years were up, if the apprentice had served faithfully and learned his trade, his indenture would end. He was now a journeyman. The term comes from the French journée, meaning day. He was now free to work for a daily wage, but he was not yet a master. He did not yet have the right to open his own shop or train his own apprentices. To do that, he often had to embark on a period of travel, working for different masters in different towns, broadening his skills and learning new techniques. After several years as a journeyman, he could petition the guild to become a master. This usually required 2 things, a hefty fee and the submission of a masterpiece, a piece of work that proved his absolute command of the craft. For a baker, it might be a particularly complex loaf. For a carpenter, an ornate chest. For a blacksmith, a finely wrought sword. If the masters of the guild judged his work and his character to be satisfactory, he would be admitted to their ranks. He could finally open his own shop, marry, and perhaps take on a young, terrified apprentice of his own, starting the cycle anew. This entire journey, from a 10-year-old boy sleeping under the counter to a 40-year-old master with his own business, was a monumental undertaking. It was a life's work. The modern idea of switching careers every few years would have been utterly incomprehensible. You were a cooper, or a tanner, or a mason. That was not just your job, it was your identity, your community, your entire world. And what of the girls? For daughters of craftsmen and merchants, their future was just as prescribed, though their workshop was almost always the home. A girl's education was, in essence, a domestic apprenticeship. She was trained by her mother in the complex and vital skills of running an urban household. This was no small task. A master's wife was a business partner, a manager, a foreman. She was in charge of the household budget, the feeding of the family and the apprentices, the purchasing of supplies, the making of clothes, the tending of the sick. A girl would learn how to manage a kitchen that was also a small-scale food production facility. This meant not just cooking, but brewing ale, the staple drink for everyone, safer than water, salting and smoking meat for preservation, making cheese and butter, and tending a kitchen garden. She learned to spin thread and weave cloth, skills essential for clothing her family. She learned the basics of herbal medicine, becoming the family's first line of defense against illness. She was learning to be the CEO of a domestic enterprise. While most guilds were closed to women, some were not. In trades related to textiles like weaving or silk production, women could sometimes become apprentices and even masters. More often, a woman would learn the trade informally from her father or husband. If he died, his widow might be granted the right by the guild to carry on the family business, a pragmatic recognition of her skill and a way to keep the workshop from failing. But for most girls, their training was geared towards one ultimate goal: marriage. A girl who was a skilled household manager was a valuable asset, bringing a dowry not just of money or land, but of competence. Her education was to prepare her to run the household of her future husband, be he a baker, a blacksmith, or a merchant. And then, at the very peak of the social pyramid, we find the children of the nobility. Here again, the educational path was starkly different, forged with an entirely different purpose in mind. A nobleman's son was not being trained for a trade or for the church. He was being trained for power. He was being trained for violence. Like the apprentice, the noble boy's education also began by leaving home. Usually around the age of 7, he would be sent to the castle of a more powerful lord, or perhaps even to the royal court. This was not a sign of parental neglect. It was a vital part of his political and social education. He would build relationships with the sons of other powerful families, alliances that would serve him for the rest of his life. He was learning the intricate web of kinship and loyalty that held the feudal world together. His first stage was that of a page. As a page, his life was one of service. He would serve the lord and lady of the castle at their table, learning etiquette, courtly manners, and how to conduct himself in the presence of power. It was a humbling but essential education in the hierarchies of his world. He would be taught by the ladies of the court to sing, to play music, to dance, and perhaps to read and write, often in French, the language of the aristocracy. But his most important lessons were martial. He would begin his training with wooden swords and small shields, learning the basic stances and blows of combat. He learned to ride a horse until it was an extension of his own body. He learned the arts of falconry and the hunt, which were not just sports but crucial training for war. Around the age of 14, if he had proven himself worthy, he would graduate to become a squire. This was the most intense and dangerous phase of his education. He would be assigned to a specific knight, acting as his personal attendant. His life now revolved around the arts of war. He was responsible for his knight's armor, a complex and priceless suit of metal plates and mail that had to be kept clean, polished and in perfect repair. He cared for his knight's horses, the powerful war horses that were the medieval equivalent of a battle tank. He learned how to arm his master for battle, a complex process that required skill and strength. He learned about strategy and tactics, not in a classroom, but by observing his knight in council and on the march. And most importantly, he accompanied his knight into battle. This was his final exam, and it was terrifyingly real. He would stand just behind the line of combat, ready with a spare horse, a new lance, or to help his master if he was unhorsed. He would fight, and he would see men die. He learned courage not from a book, but from the brutal reality of the battlefield. The squire was an apprentice in the most lethal trade of all. If he survived his squirehood and proved his valor, he would, around the age of 21, be deemed ready to become a knight himself. This was marked by a ceremony known as dubbing, where his master, or another great lord, would tap him on the shoulder with a sword, and declare him a knight. He was now a master of his craft. He had completed his education. And what of his sister, the noble girl? Her education was just as rigorous and just as purposeful, but geared towards a different form of power. She too might be sent to another noble household to be a lady-in-waiting. Her curriculum was designed to make her a prime candidate for a strategic marriage alliance. The fate of kingdoms could rest on her marriage. She was taught to read and write, often in both Latin and the vernacular. She learned to manage the vast and complex logistics of a castle household. A great castle was not a home. It was a military garrison, an administrative centre, and a bustling village all in one. Managing its supplies, its staff, its finances was a staggering task. She learned the skills of a diplomat, how to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life, how to be charming, graceful, and politically astute. She learned music, dance, and embroidery, not as mere hobbies, but as signals of her refined status. While her brother learned to wield a sword, she learned to wield influence. In a world where her husband might be away at war for months or years on end, she would be the one left in charge, responsible for defending the castle and managing the estates. Her education was in statecraft, diplomacy, and management. She was being forged not into a warrior, but into a ruler. So we see a world of carefully constructed paths. The peasant child, taught by the seasons. The clerk, forged in the cold discipline of the monastery. The craftsman, shaped by the 7-year hammer of apprenticeship. The noble, educated in the twin arts of courtly grace and brutal warfare. For every child, the future was a mould, and their youth was the process of being poured into it. There was little room for deviation, little space for personal ambition that ran counter to the needs of the family or the rigid structure of society. Whether they spent their days memorizing Latin verbs, learning to shoe a horse, mastering the spin of a wool thread, or practicing swordplay in a castle courtyard, they were all learning the same fundamental lesson that the peasant child had learned first. They were learning their place. They were being made into what the world demanded them to be. The raw material of childhood was being systematically, and often harshly, forged into the finished product of the medieval adult, ready to take their designated spot in the vast, unyielding, and intricately connected machinery of their world. Chapter 4. A fragile existence, disease, medicine, and the ever-present threat of death. But there was a catch, a terrible, silent, and ever-present caveat to this whole intricate process of forging a child into their designated role. That vast, unyielding machinery of the world only had a place for you if you were still there to take it. The finished product, so carefully and harshly shaped, was breathtakingly fragile. It could be shattered by forces that no one could see, that no one understood, and that no amount of training, be it with a sword or a spindle, could ever prepare you for. Before a child could be forged into an adult, they first had to pass through a gauntlet, a relentless trial not of skill or status, but of pure dumb luck. They had to survive, and in the medieval world, survival was the first, and by far the greatest lesson of all. For us, a child's cough is an inconvenience, a trip to the pharmacy, a few days off school, perhaps a sleepless night or two spent with a vaporizer humming in the corner. For the medieval parent, a child's cough was the opening whisper of a potential tragedy. It was the sound of a silent, invisible enemy testing the locks on the door, because once that enemy was inside the house, you had almost nothing to fight it with. The very air, it seemed, was filled with these malevolent spirits of sickness. We know them today by their clinical names: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, smallpox. To the medieval family, they were simply the sickness, the pox, or the fever. They were terrifying, shape-shifting monsters that arrived without warning. One day, a child is chasing a chicken in the yard, their laughter echoing in the cool air. The next, they are listless. Then comes the heat, a dry, unnatural warmth that radiates from their small body, a sign that a battle has begun within, and the parent could do little more than watch from the ramparts as this invisible war was waged. Imagine trying to comfort a child covered in the angry red rash of the measles, their eyes sensitive to the meagre light filtering through the hut, their fever so high they speak nonsense in their sleep. Imagine the horror of smallpox, the pustules that erupted across the skin, transforming a beloved face into something unrecognizable, and leaving behind cruel pitted scars on the few who were strong enough to endure it. Or the sound of whooping cough, a truly demonic possession of the lungs. The child would cough and cough, a desperate, racking series of convulsions, unable to breathe in, until finally, with a terrifying high-pitched whoop, their starved lungs would drag in a sliver of air, only for the cycle to begin again. The parents could only hold them, pat their backs and pray that the child's body wouldn't simply give out from the sheer exhaustion of trying to breathe. And then there were the enemies that attacked from within, the diseases of the gut. In a world without sanitation, where water was often contaminated and food preservation was a constant struggle, dysentery was a relentless predator. They called it the bloody flux, a name that is as brutally descriptive as it is horrifying. It would tear through a village, especially in the summer months, and it was particularly cruel to the young. It stole the very life fluid from a child's body, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and hollowed out in a matter of days. The parents would try to spoon water or thin broth between their lips, watching in despair as the sickness simply refused to let the body hold on to anything. This wasn't a trip to the paediatrician for a round of bubblegum-flavoured antibiotics and a stern lecture about finishing the whole course. This was a desperate, lonely vigil in a smoky, dark room, with the life of a child hanging by the thinnest of threads. The medieval world was a world without germ theory. They had no concept of viruses or bacteria. Sickness wasn't caused by microorganisms. It was a fundamental imbalance, a punishment from God, or even the result of a malicious puff of bad air, a miasma drifting in from a nearby swamp. So if you don't know what causes the problem, how on earth do you begin to solve it? Well, they had a system. It was a wonderfully elegant, if completely and utterly wrong, system that governed nearly all of Western medicine for over 1,000 years. It was the theory of the four humours. The human body, they believed, was a little microcosm of the entire universe, made up of the same four basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Each of these elements corresponded to a fluid, or a humour, in the body. Earth corresponded to black bile, which was cold and dry and made you melancholic. Air was connected to blood, which was hot and moist and made you sanguine, or cheerful. Fire was yellow bile, hot and dry, making you choleric or angry. And water was phlegm, cold and moist, making you phlegmatic or calm. A healthy person was someone whose four humours were in perfect harmonious balance. Sickness, therefore, was simply a matter of having too much or too little of one of these fluids. It was their grand unified theory of everything for the human body, a single, all-encompassing explanation for every ailment imaginable. Did your child have a fever? Clearly, an excess of hot and dry yellow bile, a runny nose and a chesty cough, far too much cold and moist phlegm. It was a deeply flawed but internally consistent operating system for understanding the body, and every single treatment, from the university-trained physician to the village-wise woman, was aimed at one simple goal: restoring that delicate balance. The first line of defense was usually the mother, armed with a body of knowledge passed down through generations. She was the family's first responder. She would turn to the garden, the forest, and the field for her pharmacy. Poultices of mustard or onions might be placed on the chest to draw out a fever or a cough. Teas would be brewed from herbs like chamomile to soothe the stomach, or willow bark, which we now know contains a substance similar to aspirin, to bring down a fever. These remedies were a blend of practical experience and folk belief. Sometimes they offered a bit of comfort. Sometimes a particular plant might even have a genuine mild medicinal effect. But against the onslaught of smallpox or diphtheria, it was the medieval equivalent of trying to fight a dragon with a butter knife. If the mother's remedies failed and the child worsened, the family might seek out someone with more specialized knowledge. In a village, this would be the local wise woman or cunning man who possessed a deeper knowledge of herbalism, often mixed with a healthy dose of charms and spells. They might create an amulet for the child to wear, with specific herbs sewn into it, or mutter an incantation to ward off the evil spirits of sickness. This wasn't seen as being in conflict with religion. It was just another tool in the toolbox. You prayed to God and the saints, and you wore the charm. You covered all your bases. If you had money, if you were a merchant or a lord, you could afford to call in the professionals, and the medieval medical professional came in a few different flavours. First, there was the apothecary, a master of herbs and minerals who could mix up more complex and expensive concoctions. Then there was the barber surgeon. This was the hands-on guy. His trade was cutting, both hair and, well, everything else. He was the one you went to for setting a broken bone, pulling a tooth, or the most common medical procedure of the age, bloodletting. The logic of bloodletting flowed directly from the theory of the humours. If a fever was caused by an excess of hot, moist blood, then the most direct solution was to simply get some of that excess blood out of the body. It was the go-to answer for just about everything, much like turning a computer off and on again is for us. The barber surgeon would take a small, sharp knife called a lancet and make a neat incision in a vein, usually in the arm, letting a prescribed amount of blood drain into a bowl. For a child, the amount would be smaller, but the principle was the same. Or, for a more targeted approach, they'd use leeches, placing the slimy, wriggling creatures on the skin to suck out the bad blood from a specific area. Imagine the terror for a small child, already feeling weak and miserable, of being held down while a stranger cuts them, or applies these strange blood-sucking worms to their body. The parents, watching with a mixture of hope and fear, believed this was a necessary life-saving intervention. They were trying to help, but what they were actually doing, in most cases, was further weakening a body that needed every last drop of strength to fight off the actual disease. They were unwittingly aiding the enemy. If you were very wealthy, you might even summon a physician. A physician was a man of learning, university-trained, who had read the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates. He considered himself above the manual labor of surgery. His job was diagnosis. He would arrive, often in impressive robes, and perform a detailed examination. He would study the child's pallor, check their pulse, and most importantly, he would spend a great deal of time examining the child's urine. The color, consistency, smell, and even the taste of urine were seen as a direct window into the state of the humors. An entire diagnostic science, uroscopy, was built around it, with elaborate charts showing what different shades of urine signified. After his careful consideration, the physician would pronounce his verdict. The child had an excess of phlegm, perhaps, and he would prescribe a cure, but he wouldn't administer it himself. He would prescribe a diet. Foods were also categorized as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and perhaps a treatment to be carried out by the barber surgeon or the apothecary. To rebalance the humors, you could remove the excess, as with bloodletting, or you could try to force it out through other means. Emetics would be prescribed to make the child vomit, or purgatives and laxatives to empty their bowels. Again, the goal was to expel the humor that was causing the imbalance, so a sick child, already struggling with dehydration from a fever or dysentery, would be subjected to treatments that dehydrated them even further, hastening the very outcome everyone was trying to prevent. And woven through all of this, for every single person from the lowest peasant to the highest king, was the constant and unwavering presence of faith. Sickness was ultimately in God's hands. A child's illness was a test of faith, a punishment for sin, or simply part of God's mysterious and unknowable plan. So you prayed. You prayed with a desperate intensity that we can scarcely imagine. You prayed to Jesus and the Virgin Mary, and you prayed to a whole host of specialized saints. Saint Blaise was the one to call on for afflictions of the throat, like diphtheria, Saint Vitus for convulsions. Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of children himself, would be inundated with the prayers of terrified parents. If you could, you would go on a pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint, or touch a holy relic, a sliver of bone, a thread of cloth believed to hold curative powers. The church was the ultimate hospital, and prayer was the most powerful medicine. It was a source of immense comfort, a way of feeling like you were doing something in the face of absolute helplessness. It provided a framework for understanding suffering, but it could not stop a virus. Beyond these dramatic invasions of disease, the world itself was a minefield of everyday dangers. A modern childhood is a carefully curated experience, bubble-wrapped and safety-checked. The medieval childhood was anything but. For a peasant child, the farm was a landscape of potential disasters. A kick from a horse or an ox could crush a small body in an instant. A fall from a hayloft could result in a broken bone. And a simple fracture, a clean break that we would treat with a cast and a few weeks of inconvenience, could be a catastrophe. With no real understanding of how to set bones properly, a broken leg could lead to a permanent crippling limp. If the skin was broken, infection was almost a certainty. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could fester, the infection spreading through the limb and then the body, leading to a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. For the child apprenticed in a town, the workshop held its own set of dangers. The young blacksmith's assistant worked amidst open flames and flying sparks. The weaver's apprentice operated complex machinery that could catch and mangle a small hand. The tanner's boy worked with caustic chemicals. There were no safety regulations, no child labor laws. An injury that prevented you from working was not just a medical problem, it was an economic disaster for your family. Even nature was a more immediate threat. A child wandering too close to a fast-flowing river could be swept away. A toddler who strayed from the cottage could easily get lost in the woods, falling prey to exposure or animals. Winter, as we have seen, was a sentient monster that was always trying to get in, and a small body with less fat and a greater surface area would succumb to the cold far more quickly than an adult's. And beneath all these sudden violent threats, there was a quieter, more insidious killer at work: malnutrition. For the vast majority of the population, life was lived on the edge of subsistence. Getting enough calories to simply survive the day was the primary goal. The diet was monotonous and often nutritionally poor, consisting mostly of coarse bread, pottage, a kind of vegetable and grain stew, and whatever else could be farmed or foraged. Meat was a rare luxury for peasants. Fresh fruit was seasonal. Dairy was available, but could also be a source of disease if it spoiled. This chronic lack of good nutrition made children uniquely vulnerable. Their growing bodies were like houses being built with substandard materials. Without enough protein, their muscles couldn't develop properly. Without enough calcium, their bones grew soft and weak. Rickets, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin D, was common, resulting in bowed legs and deformed skeletons. Scurvy, from a lack of vitamin C, would cause their gums to bleed and their teeth to loosen. Anemia from iron deficiency would leave them perpetually pale and exhausted. This underlying malnutrition was the perfect ally for disease. It weakened the immune system, turning the body's natural defenses into a disorganized, undersupplied militia. A well-fed child might be able to fight off a bout of measles. A malnourished child would be overwhelmed. Their body simply didn't have the resources to wage the war. One of the most dangerous periods in a medieval child's life was weaning. For the first year or so, breast milk provided a near-perfect source of nutrition and, crucially, passed on some of the mother's immunities. But when the time came to wean the child onto solid food, they were suddenly thrust into a world of nutritional peril. The food they were given, often a thin, watery gruel called pap, made from bread soaked in water or milk, was a massive step down in quality. This sudden dietary shock, combined with the loss of their mother's antibodies and their first direct exposure to contaminated food and water, made this a period of incredibly high mortality. So many toddlers sickened and died during this transition that it was known as the weaning sickness. It was another one of the great hurdles a child had to clear on the path to adulthood. So what was the psychological impact of living in a world where a child's life was so precarious? It's tempting to fall back on an old, rather cynical theory that medieval parents faced with such high rates of infant and child mortality simply didn't get as attached to their children, that they maintained a kind of emotional distance, knowing that the small person they were raising might be gone tomorrow. It's a way of making the past seem more alien, more brutal, and less like us. But the evidence, when you look closely, tells a very different story. The grief was real. It was immense. We find it in the quiet corners of the historical record. We see it in legal documents, where a father refers to a deceased child with heart-wrenching tenderness. We see it in the prayers and letters of the literate, who pour out their sorrow onto the page. We see it most poignantly in the art and artifacts they left behind. The wealthy would commission effigies for the tombs of their children, small, perfect stone figures of the child they lost, sleeping for eternity. These are not the actions of people who did not care. They are the actions of people who are heartbroken. But the way they processed and expressed that grief was different. It was filtered through the lens of their worldview. Their faith taught them that a child who died after baptism went straight to heaven to become an angel in the presence of God. This was a source of genuine and powerful consolation. It didn't erase the pain of their absence on earth, but it offered the profound hope of a reunion in the afterlife. It transformed a meaningless tragedy into a part of a divine plan. In the world of folk belief, another, stranger explanation sometimes took hold, a way for the human mind to rationalize the inexplicable. This was the idea of the changeling. The belief was that fairies, or other supernatural beings, coveted human children. They would sneak into a home and steal a healthy, happy baby, leaving in its place a sickly, wizened and fretful fairy creature, a changeling. Think about what this story accomplishes. Your beautiful, thriving baby suddenly falls ill. They stop growing. They cry incessantly. Their features seem to change as the sickness wastes them away. It is terrifying and makes no sense. How much easier is it to believe that this is not your child anymore, that your real child was stolen, and this creature is an imposter? It provides a narrative, an explanation for a random horror. It externalizes the blame. It wasn't a failure of your care, or a random sickness. It was a supernatural crime. It's a dark and fascinating example of folklore, serving as a psychological coping mechanism in a world that offered few others. And so, for the parents, life was a constant state of vigilance and prayer. For the community, the death of a child was a familiar tragedy, a sorrowful but accepted part of the rhythm of life. Funerals for the very young were common. Whole families could be hollowed out by a single wave of sickness passing through a village. Every single adult you would have met in the medieval world was a survivor of this brutal gauntlet. Every one of them would have lost siblings. Every parent likely would have buried at least one child, if not more. This constant presence of death fundamentally shaped their understanding of childhood. It was not seen as a safe, protected garden, a time of innocent play to be cherished and extended. It was seen as a probationary period, a time of immense vulnerability. The goal was not to simply enjoy childhood, but to get through it, to survive the fevers, the fluxes, the accidents and the famines, to emerge on the other side, hardened and lucky, ready at last to be forged into that finished product, that adult who could finally take their designated spot in the machinery of the world. The ones who made it were not just trained or educated. They were the improbable winners of a lottery they never even knew they were playing. They were the few branches that survived the frost, destined to grow however crookedly toward the light. Chapter 5. Shaping the Soul. Faith, Family, and the Rod of Discipline. But growing toward the light was not a passive act. It wasn't enough for a branch to simply survive the frost. Every gardener knows that a branch left to its own devices will grow wild, tangled, and unproductive. It must be shaped, it must be pruned, tied, and bent, sometimes harshly, to ensure it grows in the right direction. And in the medieval world, the right direction was always, unequivocally, toward God. Physical survival was merely the entry fee into the far more consequential struggle, the battle for the soul. You see, the modern idea of a child as a bundle of innocence, a pure, clean slate upon which we write lessons of kindness and wonder, would have been seen as not just naive but dangerously heretical. The prevailing operating system of the medieval mind was built on a far grimmer premise. The doctrine of original sin, the story of Adam and Eve, wasn't just a cautionary tale. It was the diagnosis for a hereditary disease that infected every single baby born into the world. A child was not a blank slate. They were a slate already scribbled upon with disobedience, pride, and an innate pull toward chaos. That beautiful little baby cooing in its swaddling was seen as a vessel already tainted, a tiny creature with a will that, if left unchecked, would lead it straight into the arms of the devil and an eternity of damnation. So, when a medieval parent looked at their child, they didn't just see a future farmer or a future wife. They saw a tiny, vulnerable soul already in mortal peril. Every tantrum, every act of defiance, every refusal to obey wasn't just a frustrating phase of toddlerhood. It was a symptom of that deeper spiritual sickness. It was the old Adam rearing its head, and the parents' most sacred duty, a duty imposed upon them by God himself, was to break that willful spirit, not to be cruel, but to be loving. In their worldview, allowing a child's will to flourish was the ultimate act of parental neglect. It was like letting a child play with fire, only the fire was eternal hellfire. This shaped every single interaction. The goal of child rearing was not self-esteem or creative expression or personal fulfillment. The goal was submission. Submission to the parents as God's representatives on earth, submission to the feudal lord as the king's representative, and ultimate submission to God and his church. The entire structure of society depended on this chain of obedience, and it was forged in the nursery. The primary tool for this forging was, of course, the church. From the moment a child drew its first breath, it was enveloped in the spiritual framework of Christendom. The first and most urgent act was baptism. This was no gentle celebratory christening with a reception and cake afterward. This was an emergency spiritual intervention. Infant mortality was so terrifyingly high that parents lived in a state of low-grade panic, desperate to have the rite performed before it was too late. An unbaptized baby who died was, according to mainstream theology, barred from heaven, cast into a sorrowful grey eternity known as limbo. Priests were permitted to perform emergency baptisms with any available water if a baby was failing. The midwife herself was often instructed on how to do it, because a moment's delay could mean the difference between an eternity of sorrow and the hope of paradise. So imagine that scene, the frantic parents, the weak and wailing infant, the desperate dash to wash away that original sin before the child's fragile life was extinguished. It was their first and most important vaccination, a vaccination for the soul. Once that initial crisis was averted, the religious instruction began, and it was relentless. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Children didn't just learn prayers, they absorbed them through osmosis. The day was punctuated by the sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer, the Angelus at morning, noon and night. Grace was said before every meagre meal. Bedtime prayers were not a gentle "now I lay me down to sleep," but often a recitation of the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria and the Credo, in Latin if possible. Most peasant children would have learnt them by rote, mumbling sounds they barely understood, the meaning seeping in slowly over years of repetition. It was a world saturated with the divine. Saints were a constant presence, acting as a kind of supernatural extended family. Every child had a patron saint, usually the one they were named for, who was their personal advocate in heaven. Having a problem? There was a saint for that. Lost something? Pray to Saint Anthony. Afraid of thunderstorms? Saint Barbara was your woman. These weren't abstract theological concepts. They were real, accessible helpers in a world full of danger and uncertainty. Children would have heard stories of the saints read aloud in church, or told by the fire tales of heroic faith, gruesome martyrdom and incredible miracles. These were the superheroes of the Middle Ages, and their stories provided the moral and ethical signposts for a child's life. Don't lie, or you'll end up like Ananias. Be brave, like St. George facing the dragon. Be pure, like the Virgin Mary. But these lessons were not always gentle fables. The church also relied heavily on what we might politely call scare tactics. The walls of the parish church were the medieval equivalent of a horror movie. They were covered in vivid paintings of the Last Judgment, with Christ enthroned in glory, separating the righteous from the damned. And the artists did not hold back on the details. On one side you'd see the blessed being welcomed into heaven by angels. On the other, you'd see the screaming naked souls of the damned being prodded by pitchforks into the gaping fiery maw of hell, tormented by grotesque demons in scenes of exquisite and imaginative torture. A small child, sitting on the cold stone floor during a long sermon, would stare at these images for hours. This wasn't an abstract threat, it was a painted promise of what awaited a disobedient soul. It was a graphic, full-colour warning that made the consequences of sin terrifyingly real. Forget a timeout. The ultimate punishment was eternal agony, and you got to see the previews every Sunday. With this theological backdrop that a child is born corrupt and stands on the precipice of eternal damnation, the medieval approach to discipline starts to make a grim kind of sense. The Bible itself provided the justification. The Book of Proverbs was essentially the parenting manual of the age, and its advice was clear: "He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes." Or, "Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him." The rod was not a metaphor. Corporal punishment was the universal, unquestioned, and morally required method of child rearing across all social classes. It was seen as a spiritual duty, an act of love. To beat a child was to save a child. It wasn't done out of anger, at least not in theory. Ideally, it was a calm, deliberate act of correction. The goal was to break the child's sinful will, that stubborn, selfish pride that was the root of all evil. It was to make the body suffer a little, now to save the soul from suffering for eternity. A modern parent might say, "This hurts me more than it hurts you," as a kind of platitude. A medieval parent believed it in the most literal sense possible. Their own salvation could be put at risk if they failed in their duty to properly discipline their offspring. The methods were varied. For minor infractions, a cuff or a slap would suffice. For more serious disobedience, a parent would use a birch rod, a switch from a tree, a leather strap, or even just their bare hand. The punishment was meant to be painful and humiliating. There was no concept of a child's right to bodily autonomy. A child's body belonged to its parents, to be moulded and corrected as they saw fit, just as their soul belonged to God. This applied to everything. Children were beaten for lying, for stealing, for disobedience, for laziness at their chores, and for failing to learn their lessons. In monastic schools, where boys were sent to become monks or clerks, the flogging of students was a routine part of the curriculum, as common as learning to conjugate a Latin verb. It's easy for us, from the comfort of our world, to look back on this with pure horror and label it as nothing but abuse, and by our standards, it absolutely was. But to understand their world, we have to try to see it through their eyes. They lived in a universe where pain was a constant companion. Life was brutal. Animals were beaten to make them work. Criminals were publicly flogged or executed. and warfare was a spectacle of savage violence. Pain was not something to be avoided at all costs. It was a fundamental part of the human experience, and often a tool for purification. The suffering of the martyrs was celebrated. The suffering of Christ on the cross was the central act of salvation. In a world that saw suffering as potentially redemptive, inflicting pain on a child to save their soul from a far greater eternal pain seemed not just logical, but profoundly righteous. This brings us to the great historical debate about the medieval family. For a long time, some historians argued that because of the high infant mortality rates and the harsh disciplinary customs, medieval parents were emotionally distant from their children. The theory, known as the indifference thesis, suggested that parents couldn't afford to get too attached to a child who was statistically likely to die. They invested less love, less care, and less grief in their offspring because the emotional cost was simply too high. It paints a picture of a cold, unfeeling world where children were, at best, miniature adults in waiting and, at worst, disposable assets. But as we dig deeper, a much more complex and recognizably human picture emerges. The evidence of parental love is everywhere, if you know where to look. It's just that it was expressed in ways that fit their world, not ours. Think about the desperation to have a child baptized. Does that sound like indifference, or does it sound like a profound, terrified love? A desperate desire to ensure a child's eternal well-being, even if their earthly life was destined to be short. Parents who lost children grieved, and they grieved deeply. We have letters from the period expressing gut-wrenching sorrow. One Italian merchant in the 14th century wrote of his deceased son, "I am left in such grief and tribulation that I have lost all heart, and it seems to me that I see him before me all the time." That is not the voice of indifference. That is the raw, timeless voice of a heartbroken father. Wealthy families would commission expensive and beautiful effigies for the tombs of their children, miniature stone figures with hands clasped in prayer, a public and permanent testament to their loss and their love. These weren't cheap, perfunctory markers. They were significant investments of resources, meant to honor the memory of a cherished child. We also see love in the small, intimate details of family life. We find lullabies from the period, gentle songs meant to soothe a baby to sleep. Legal records and chronicles mention pet names and affectionate diminutives used for children. Toys, though simple, existed. Things like spinning tops, carved wooden knights and dolls made of rags. These weren't the actions of people who saw children as unlovable, sinful monsters. They were the actions of people who, despite their terrifying theology, couldn't help but fall in love with their own kids. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory pictures? The parent who would lovingly rock a child to sleep with a lullaby, and the same parent who would, the next day, beat that child with a birch rod for an act of defiance. The truth is, they didn't see a contradiction. Both actions sprang from the same source, a desire for the child's ultimate good. One was for their temporal comfort, the other for their eternal salvation. In their minds, the physical beating was the greater act of love, the harder and more necessary one. It was their sacred, painful duty. The family structure itself was the crucible for all this. The medieval household, especially for the peasantry, was not the private, child-centric bubble we know today. It was a crowded, bustling, multi-generational economic unit. The one-room peasant hovel would have been home to parents, children, perhaps a grandparent or two, and sometimes even a servant or an apprentice, all living and sleeping in the same space. And let's not forget the animals. It was not uncommon, especially in the cold of winter, to bring the chickens, a pig, or even the family cow inside for warmth and for their security. So forget about a quiet, private nursery. A child's world was a constant swirl of adults, other children, and livestock. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. A child was born into a web of relationships and, more importantly, a web of obligations. The family was a team, and every member, from the youngest to the oldest, was expected to contribute as soon as they were able. The idea of a childhood as a protected, work-free period of play and education is a very modern invention. For most medieval children, childhood was a very short apprenticeship for adulthood. As we've touched on, from the age of 7, you were considered capable of work and responsibility. You were part of the family's labour force. The father was the undisputed head of this household, the pater familias. He held legal and moral authority over his wife, his children and his servants. His word was law, but the mother was the heart of the domestic sphere. She managed the household, prepared the food, made the clothes, tended the garden, and was of course the primary caregiver for the very young. It was she who would have nursed the babies, taught them their first prayers, and administered the daily casual discipline. In this crowded, demanding environment, love was often expressed through practicality. A father showed his love not by playing catch, but by working himself to the bone to provide a scrap of bread for the table. A mother showed her love by sitting up all night with a feverish child, applying a cool cloth, and praying desperately to the Virgin Mary for help. It was a love expressed through action, through sacrifice, through the grim, shared struggle for survival in this world and salvation in the next. So we have to peel back the layers of our own assumptions about what love and family are supposed to look like. They lived in a world where the stakes felt infinitely higher than they do for us. We worry about our children's grades, their social skills, their future careers. They worried about their children's immortal souls. They believed with every fibre of their being that a moment of indulgence or a failure of discipline could lead to an eternity of torment. Seen through that lens, the rod of discipline, as harsh as it seems to us, becomes a desperate tool of salvation, wielded by parents who were terrified, not indifferent. They were trying to shape the crooked branches of their children, to force them to grow toward the only light that mattered, fighting against a darkness they believed was coiled inside the very heart of the child they loved. Chapter 6. Thresholds of Adulthood. Law, Marriage, and Rites of Passage. And so, this shaping, this constant desperate effort to mold a child's soul, was always done against a ticking clock, because eventually the time for shaping would run out. The world, with its laws and its expectations, would step in and declare the work finished, whether it truly was or not. One day, the child who was seen as a vessel of potential sin, needing constant correction, would cross an invisible line, and on the other side of that line, they were no longer a child to be disciplined, but an adult to be judged. Their actions suddenly carried a new and terrifying weight, not just in the eyes of God, but in the eyes of the law. This transition, this journey to the threshold of adulthood, is one of the most jarring and unfamiliar aspects of the medieval world for us to look back on. For us, childhood is a protected space with clearly marked exits. We have a sweet 16, the right to drive, the age of consent, the right to vote at 18, the ability to drink at 21. It's a ladder, with each rung marked by a birthday cake and a new set of legal permissions. The medieval world had no such ladder. It had a series of disconnected, often contradictory tripwires scattered across a foggy field. There was no single moment when you became an adult. Instead, you became an adult in phases, in different ways, in different jurisdictions, and often based on criteria that had nothing to do with how many years you'd been on the planet. The very concept of a specific age was slippery. For the vast majority of people, peasants tied to the land, birth records were non-existent. You were born around harvest time, or in the spring of the bad frost. Your age was a guess, an estimate based on your size, your strength, and whether you had all your adult teeth. You were old enough to work when you were strong enough to carry your weight. You were old enough to marry when you were physically capable of producing heirs. Function trumped date of birth every time. It was a world less interested in what your birth certificate said, and far more interested in what you could do. But the law, in its slow, grinding way, demanded definitions. You couldn't run a society, especially one built on inheritance and property, without some rules about who was a person, and who was, for lack of a better term, a person in training. So the legal scholars and church fathers, drawing on old Roman law, came up with a framework. It was an awkward, one-size-fits-all garment thrown over a messy reality. The first major threshold was the age of 7. Before you turned 7, you were considered an infans, a creature without reason. In the eyes of the law and the church, a 6-year-old was essentially a talking animal. You couldn't be held accountable for a crime because you lacked the mental capacity to form intent. You couldn't make a binding promise. You couldn't testify in court. You couldn't even properly sin, because sin required a conscious choice to do wrong. It was a state of perfect, blameless innocence, at least on paper. If a 5-year-old burned down the village hayrick, it was a tragedy, like a bolt of lightning striking. It wasn't arson. But the day you turned 7, everything changed. You crossed the line into the age of reason. This didn't mean you were suddenly considered a mature, rational being. It just meant that the potential for reason now existed within you. You were now what they called doli capax, capable of malice. This was a legal grey zone, a sort of juvenile court that existed inside a magistrate's mind. A 10-year-old who stole a loaf of bread could, in theory, be tried as an adult. But the court had to determine if the child understood that stealing was wrong. It led to almost comical courtroom scenes, where a grim-faced judge would question a small child trying to ascertain their grasp of complex moral and legal philosophy. Did young Piers know that taking the chicken was a violation of his neighbour's property rights and a sin against God, or did he just see a feathered friend he wanted to play with? The answer to that question could be the difference between a stern lecture and the gallows. If 7 was the dawn of reason, then the next great threshold was the high noon of legal responsibility. For boys, this was generally set at 14. For girls, it was 12. At these ages, you were, for most intents and purposes, considered an adult in the eyes of the law. The grey area vanished. You were now fully capable of malice. You could be tried, convicted, and executed for a crime just like any 30-year-old. Your intent was no longer questioned. It was assumed. If you think the pressure of getting your driver's permit at 16 is a lot, imagine knowing that your 14th birthday meant you were now eligible for the full, brutal force of the medieval justice system. You could also now manage your own property, if you were lucky enough to have any. An orphaned nobleman who had been a ward of the court could at 14 theoretically take control of his own estates. He could sign contracts, collect rents, and lead his own men-at-arms. Whether he was remotely prepared for this is another question entirely. Many a family fortune was squandered by a newly minted adult, a little too eager to enjoy the perks of his inheritance. But the primary reason these ages 12 and 14 were so critically important had little to do with crime or property. It was about the single most significant transition in any medieval person's life, the event that truly marked the end of childhood and the beginning of adulthood: marriage. For us, marriage is the culmination of a personal journey. It's about love, partnership, and individual choice. In the Middle Ages, particularly for the upper classes, marriage was none of those things. It was a transaction. It was a diplomatic alliance. It was a business merger, and the children were the primary assets being traded. A daughter wasn't just a beloved family member. She was a political tool, a vessel for continuing a bloodline, a bridge to unite two powerful houses and their lands. Her personal feelings on the matter were, to be blunt, irrelevant. The process often began in infancy. Two powerful lords, wanting to secure an alliance, might betroth their 2-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter. This was a sponsoria de futura, a promise of a future marriage. It was a legally binding contract between the families. The two children might be raised in separate castles, perhaps meeting only once or twice in their entire childhood. They were spoken for, their futures sealed before they could even form complete sentences. But this betrothal was not yet a marriage. For the union to become truly unbreakable, for it to be a sponsoria de presenti, a marriage in the present tense, it required one crucial element: consent. And according to canon law, the law of the church, a person could give their legal consent to be married at the age of reason. 12 for a girl, 14 for a boy. Let that sink in. A girl who by our standards is just finishing elementary school could be legally married. She could stand in a cold stone church next to a man she might barely know, a man who could be her age or could just as easily be 30, 40 or 50 years her senior, and say the words that would bind her to him for life. And once those words were spoken, her life was irrevocably altered. She would leave her home, her family, her entire world, and travel to her husband's castle or estate. She was no longer a child of her father's house. She was now the lady of a new house, a wife. This wasn't a symbolic title. It came with a crushing weight of responsibility. She would be expected to learn how to manage a household, oversee servants, manage supplies, and entertain guests. This 12-year-old girl was now a COO, a chief operating officer of a complex domestic enterprise. And of course, she was expected to perform the most important duty of all: produce an heir, preferably a male one. The church, to its credit, often argued that the marriage should not be consummated until the girl had reached physical maturity, usually around 14 or 15. But the law, and the intense pressure from families desperate to secure the alliance, often had other ideas. The moment the marriage was consummated, it was legally indissoluble. There was no going back. For many young girls, this rite of passage from child to wife was a swift, terrifying, and often traumatic plunge into a world for which they were utterly unprepared. The line between the nursery and the marriage bed was shockingly, brutally thin. While marriage was the default path to adulthood for most, especially girls, for boys there were other, more formal and highly structured routes. For the son of a craftsman or a merchant in a growing town, the journey began with an apprenticeship. This was, in essence, the medieval version of leaving home for college and your first internship, all rolled into one, except it started when you were 7. A father would sign a contract with a master craftsman, a baker, a weaver, a blacksmith, and his young son would go to live in the master's house. This wasn't just a work arrangement. The master became a surrogate father. He was legally responsible for the boy's food, lodging, and moral upbringing. He also had the legal right to discipline the boy just as his own father would have, a right that we can assume was not used sparingly. For the next 7 to 10 years, the boy's life was one of grueling work and rote learning. He would start with the most menial tasks, sweeping the floors, fetching water, tending the fire. He was a servant, an observer, slowly absorbing the secrets of the trade. The hours were long, the work was physically demanding, and his childhood was effectively over. He might see his family on holidays, but his world was now the workshop. His identity was no longer son of John, but apprentice to the Guild of Candlemakers. The sensory experience of this transition must have been overwhelming. Imagine a 7-year-old boy leaving the familiar smells of his own family's small cottage and being plunged into the overwhelming stench of a tannery, the deafening clang of a forge, or the clatter and dust of a weaver's shop. His playmates were gone, replaced by older apprentices and a stern master. His freedom was gone, replaced by a rigid schedule of chores from dawn until dusk. But if he endured, if he worked hard and showed talent, he would eventually complete his term. He would produce a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated his proficiency in the craft, to be judged by the elders of the guild. If it was accepted, he would be released from his apprenticeship. He was now a journeyman, free to travel and hire out his skills. He was an adult. He had a profession. He had a place in the highly structured urban world. He had survived his rite of passage and emerged as a man. For the sons of the nobility, the path was different, but no less demanding. It was the path to the ultimate symbol of medieval manhood, knighthood. This, too, was a journey that began in early childhood. Around the age of 7 or 8, a young noble boy would be sent away from his own home to the castle of a more powerful lord, often a relative or his father's overlord. Here, he would begin his training as a page. The life of a page was not about learning to fight, not yet. It was about learning to serve. He would serve the lord and lady of the castle at their table, learning manners, etiquette, and the art of polite conversation. He would be taught to read and write, perhaps, to play music, to sing, and to play chess. He learnt the rules of heraldry and the complex social codes of the court. In between lessons he would run errands, carry messages, and help the ladies with their embroidery. It was a strange mix of being a butler in training and a student at a finishing school, all while getting a first-hand education in the politics of power by simply being in the room where it happened. Around the age of 14, that magical number again. If the page had proven himself worthy, he would be promoted to the rank of squire. Now the real training began. He was assigned to a specific knight, becoming his personal assistant, his valet, and his apprentice in the art of war. The squire's life was one of constant, exhausting physical effort. He was responsible for his knight's armour, a complex jigsaw puzzle of leather and steel that had to be kept clean, polished, and free of rust. This was not a small task. A single spot of rust could be a fatal weakness in battle. He cared for his knight's horses, the warhorse and the palfrey, which were the medieval equivalent of a tank and a luxury sedan. He had to know how to feed them, groom them, and tend to their injuries. And he trained, relentlessly. He learned to ride a horse at full gallop while carrying a heavy shield and a long, unwieldy lance. He learned to wield a sword, a mace, an axe, developing the raw muscle and stamina required to fight for hours encased in 50 pounds of metal. He practiced at the quintain, a tilting target, learning to strike it squarely in the centre without being knocked from his horse by the swinging counterweight. Most terrifyingly, he followed his knight into battle. A squire was not a non-combatant. He was an active participant. He would carry spare weapons and shields for his master, help him back onto his horse if he was unseated, guard his back, and pull him from the fray if he was wounded. He saw the horrific, visceral reality of combat up close. The screams, the mud, the blood. This was the final, brutal examination of his training. Many squires died on the battlefield, their journey to adulthood cut short. If a squire survived, if he served with courage and distinction, he might finally earn his prize. Sometime between the ages of 18 and 21, he would be deemed ready for knighthood. The ceremony, the act of dubbing, was a profound spiritual and social rite of passage. It was a baptism into a new state of being. The night before the ceremony, the squire would perform a vigil. He would take a ritual bath, a symbol of purification, and dress in a simple white tunic, symbolizing his purity of purpose. He would then spend the entire night alone in the castle chapel, kneeling or standing in prayer before the altar where his sword and armor lay. It was a time for quiet contemplation, a moment to consider the heavy vows he was about to take, to protect the weak, to uphold justice, to be loyal to his lord, and to serve God. The next morning, exhausted and solemn, he would be led out to the court. There, in front of his lord, his family, and his peers, he would be girded with his sword and spurs. He would kneel, and his lord would tap him on the shoulder with the flat of a sword, the colleague, and declare him a knight. "Arise, sir." In that moment, he was reborn. He was no longer a boy, a page, a squire. He was a knight, a member of a warrior brotherhood, a man with a title, a station, and a sacred duty. It was the end point of a long, arduous journey, a threshold crossed not by the passage of years, but by service, by training, and by blood. And for everyone, rich or poor, noble or commoner, there was one rite of passage overseen by the church, the sacrament of confirmation, usually performed by a travelling bishop. This was the moment when a child, who had been baptized as an infant, stood up and confirmed those vows for themselves. It was seen as the moment they received the gifts of the Holy Spirit, strengthening them for the spiritual battles ahead. They became, in the language of the church, a soldier of Christ. This may seem like a purely religious ceremony to us, but its social implications were huge. It was another formal marker on the road to adulthood. You had now taken personal ownership of your faith. You were spiritually accountable in a new way. In a world where religion was woven into the very fabric of existence, this was no small thing. It was a public declaration that you were no longer under the spiritual protection of your parents alone. You were now an active, responsible member of the Christian community. So what did it mean to be an adult in the Middle Ages? It meant different things at different times. You could be old enough to be hanged, but too young to inherit your father's land. You could be a wife and a mother at 13, but still be considered your husband's legal subordinate, almost like a child. You could be a master craftsman at 20, commanding a workshop of your own, while a nobleman of the same age was still a squire, waiting for his chance at knighthood. Adulthood wasn't a destination you arrived at on a specific birthday. It was a status you achieved. You achieved it through physical maturity, through legal declaration, through professional qualification, or through sacred ritual. It was a piecemeal process, a slow accumulation of responsibilities and capabilities, and perhaps the most common, unspoken rite of passage for everyone was simply survival. In a world where nearly half of all children did not live to see their 10th birthday, the very act of growing up was a triumph. To cross the threshold from the vulnerable, fragile state of childhood into the harsh, demanding world of adulthood was the greatest rite of passage of all. It was a journey fraught with peril, one that ended abruptly for so many. For those who made it, there was no long, gentle transition. The door from childhood didn't open slowly. It slammed shut behind you, and the world expected you, ready or not, to face what lay on the other side. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage, the specialized upbringing of the nobility. For those who made it, there was no long, gentle transition. The door from childhood didn't open slowly. It slammed shut behind you, and the world expected you, ready or not, to face what lay on the other side. But for a certain tiny fraction of the population, another door was already waiting. It wasn't the weather-beaten door to the fields or the workshop. This one was heavy, perhaps iron-bound oak, and it led not to a life of labour, but to a life of consequence. This was the entrance to the gilded cage. If a peasant child was a tiny, precarious boat tossed on a vast and indifferent ocean, the noble child was a ship of the line, launched with immense ceremony and freighted with the expectations of an entire dynasty. Their survival was not just a personal victory, it was a matter of state, but with that security came a different kind of peril, a cold and relentless pressure that shaped them from their very first breath. The air they breathed was different. It wasn't just cleaner, less thick with the smoke of the common hearth. It was rarefied, filled with the unspoken weight of lineage. A peasant child belonged to their parents, a noble child belonged to the bloodline. They were less a person, and more a precious strategic asset, a living, breathing, sometimes tantrum-throwing component of a grand, multi-generational game of power. Their first words might be mama, but the first concept they truly had to understand was duty. And duty, much like the winter cold, was an unforgiving master. It crept into every nursery, dictated every lesson, and chose every friend. Forget the modern idea of a childhood spent discovering yourself. A noble child's life was one of being told who you were, relentlessly, from day one. You were not simply Thomas. You were the future Baron, the heir to these specific lands, the future husband of that specific girl from the next valley over, who would secure your family's flank against your troublesome uncle. You were a link in a chain, and your one singular purpose was not to break it. The pressure was immense. It was the silent guest at every meal, the shadow that tucked you into your cold, canopied bed. There was no room for adolescent rebellion, no space for finding your own path. The path had been laid out centuries before you were born, paved with the bones and ambitions of your ancestors. Your job was simply to walk it, and for most, that walk began with a journey, a terrifying, bewildering journey away from everything they had ever known. Around the age of 7, that same magical liminal age when a peasant child took on their first real chores, the noble child often packed their bags, or rather, had their bags packed for them. This wasn't a trip to summer camp. This was a practice known as fostering, and it was the cornerstone of aristocratic upbringing. Imagine, if you will, being 7 years old. You have your own room, perhaps, your own nurse, a handful of familiar servants. You know the particular way the light falls in the solar, the specific squeak of the third step on the spiral staircase. This is your world. Then one day, you are dressed in your finest, stiffest clothes, placed on a horse, and you ride away for days. You are being sent to live in the household of another lord, maybe a powerful uncle, maybe your father's sworn ally, or maybe even your father's most significant rival. It was what we might politely call a networking opportunity, or, less politely, a long-term, high-stakes hostage situation with better food. The logic behind it was, from a medieval perspective, flawless. It was a multi-tool of diplomacy and education. Sending your son to be raised by a powerful neighbour was an incredible gesture of trust. It said, "I trust you with my heir, the future of my line, therefore we are bound together." It wove the fabric of the aristocracy into a tight, interlocking web of obligation. These children, raised together, would one day rule together, having forged bonds of friendship, or at least grudging respect in their youth. They learnt the customs, the dialects, the politics of another region from the inside. It was the ultimate study abroad program, where the final exam might involve besieging your former roommate's castle. But try explaining that to a 7-year-old. The emotional calculus is brutal. We talk today about the trauma of a first sleepover. This was a sleepover that lasted for the next 7 to 14 years. The child would arrive, a small, lonely figure in the vast, echoing courtyard of a strange castle, to be presented to their new lord and lady. These figures were now, for all intents and purposes, their parents. They would dictate the child's life, from their prayers to their punishments. The biological parents, meanwhile, would often receive another lord's child in return, a polite exchange of human collateral. This emotional distance wasn't seen as a cruelty. It was a feature, not a bug. It was designed to toughen the child, to sever the soft bonds of immediate family, and replace them with the harder, more practical bonds of political allegiance. Love was a liability. Affection was a weakness. A knight who loved his home too much might be reluctant to go to war. A lady who was too attached to her parents might resist a politically advantageous but personally distasteful marriage. The system was designed to produce pragmatic, hard-headed rulers, and it did so by carefully, methodically breaking their hearts just a little bit, right at the beginning. So let's follow our two young travellers as they dismount in that new, intimidating courtyard. Let's call them Arthur and Eleanor. They are 7 years old, and their childhood, as they knew it, is officially over. They are now apprentices in the craft of being noble. Their curriculum, however, is about to diverge dramatically. Arthur is now a page. This sounds charming, like something out of a storybook. And it was. If your storybook involves a grueling 7-year unpaid internship with very little sleep, he was assigned to the service of the lady of the castle first. This wasn't just to keep him out of trouble. It was strategic. From the lady and her retinue, he was expected to learn the soft skills that were anything but. He learned manners. Not just please and thank you, but a complex, intricate dance of etiquette that governed every interaction in the great hall. Who did you bow to? How low? Who got the best cut of meat? Who was served first? Getting this wrong wasn't just a faux pas. It could be a deadly insult, a spark in the political tinderbox of the court. He was learning to read a room, to understand the subtle shifts in power and favour that rippled through the household. His days were a blur of activity. He would rise before the sun, dress himself no easy feat in the layered, belted tunics of the time, and begin his duties. He would help the ladies with their needs, run messages through the bewildering corridors of the castle, and most importantly, serve at the high table during meals. This was the classroom. He would stand, silent and watchful, behind the lord and lady. He filled their cups, he carved their meat, he held the basin for them to wash their hands, and all the while he was listening. He was a small, invisible spy, absorbing the talk of politics, of harvests, of war. He was learning the vocabulary of power before he could properly spell his own name. His formal education was a strange mix of the practical and the poetic. A priest would drill him in Latin, the language of the church and of law. He would be taught to read and write, skills that many commoners would never possess. But this was not for the love of learning. It was so he could read treaties and manage accounts. He would learn to play chess, not as a game, but as a lesson in strategy. He would be taught to sing, to play a musical instrument like the lute, and to dance. If you think that sounds frivolous, you fundamentally misunderstand the medieval court. A man who could not dance or compose a decent verse for a lady was considered a brute, a boor, unfit for high society. These were the essential tools of courtly life, the means by which you charmed allies and navigated the treacherous social currents. A clumsy dancer was just a clumsy man, but in this world, that could be interpreted as a clumsy mind, an unsuitable leader. And then there was the other side of his education, the part that took place in the courtyard, rain or shine. From almost the moment he arrived, he was being prepared for violence. He started small. He'd practice wrestling with the other pages, hardening his body in endless tumbling scrums. He'd learn to ride a horse until the saddle felt more natural than his own 2 feet, and he'd begin his weapons training. Not with a real sword, that was far too precious and dangerous. He'd start with wooden swords and small shields, practicing basic blocks and strikes against a padded post called a quintain. He would spend hours at it, his arms aching, his knuckles raw, learning the footwork and the muscle memory that might one day save his life. The sound of wood smacking against wood was the constant soundtrack to his childhood. Life as a page was a strange paradox. He was a servant, but one of superior blood. He could be ordered about by the lowest knight, yet he outranked every non-noble in the castle. He was learning humility and arrogance in equal measure. He slept in a communal dormitory with the other pages and squires, a tumble of boys of all ages, creating a rough competitive hierarchy of their own. Forget modern concerns about bullying. This was a structured environment of physical and social dominance. You learnt your place quickly, or it was taught to you, bluntly and painfully. There was no one to run to. Complaining was a sign of weakness, the one unforgivable sin. He was being reforged, hammered into a new shape by the relentless demands of his station. Meanwhile, young Eleanor's journey has taken her to the ladies' chambers, the solar. This was the female heart of the castle, a space that was part office, part classroom, and part command centre. Her path was no less demanding than Arthur's, but her curriculum was entirely different. She was not being trained to wield a sword, but to wield a household, which in many ways was a far more complex and politically critical weapon. If Arthur was learning to be a warrior, Eleanor was learning to be a CEO. The lady of the castle, her new mentor, was not a delicate fainting figure from a romantic poem. She was a formidable administrator, a quartermaster, a doctor, and a judge. The lord might be away at war for months, even years. In his absence, she was the absolute authority. She was responsible for the defense of the castle, the management of the estates, and the welfare of hundreds of souls. This was what Eleanor was being groomed for. Her days began with prayer, followed by lessons that were intensely practical. Her equivalent of Arthur's wooden sword was the needle. We think of embroidery today as a gentle hobby. For a noblewoman, it was a display of status, a tool of piety, and a serious art form. She and the other girls would spend endless hours bent over fine linen, their fingers becoming nimble and precise, creating elaborate tapestries for the cold stone walls or richly decorated vestments for the chapel. These were not mere decorations, they were statements of the family's wealth and devotion. A poorly stitched seam was a reflection on the house itself. But her most important lessons took place throughout the castle. She would follow the lady on her daily rounds, carrying a heavy ring of keys that jingled with the sound of responsibility. This was called learning her keys. She went to the storerooms, learning to measure out the daily rations of flour, salt, and ale. She had to understand logistics, how much food was needed to sustain the household through a long winter, or even worse, a long siege. A miscalculation could mean starvation. She learned which vintages of wine were to be served to which guests, a subtle but crucial element of diplomacy. She would spend time in the kitchens, not cooking, but observing and directing the army of servants. She learnt about butchering, about preserving meats and fruits, about the rhythm of the agricultural year. She had to know what was growing in the fields, when the harvest was due, how to manage the dairy and the dovecote. The castle was a massive, hungry machine, and she was being taught how to be its chief engineer. Then there was her medical training. The lady of the house was its primary physician. Eleanor would learn the vast and complex world of herbal remedies. She'd learn to identify plants in the castle's garden, comfrey to knit bones, lavender to soothe a fever, yarrow to stop bleeding. She would be taught how to mix poultices, brew medicinal teas, and dress wounds. She'd learn the basics of setting a broken bone, and would almost certainly assist in childbirth. These were not abstract lessons. She would see gruesome injuries from the training yard. She would sit with servants dying of disease. She was being prepared for the raw, messy reality of life and death, armed not with steel but with knowledge and a steady hand. And woven through all of this was the finest, most subtle education of all, the art of politics. In the solar, with the needles clicking and the fire crackling, she listened. She learned from the lady how to welcome powerful guests, how to flatter a visiting bishop, how to subtly deflect a rude question from a rival lord. She learned to compose letters that were masterpieces of diplomacy, conveying strength without giving offence, making requests that sounded like suggestions. She was mastering the ability to manage people, to soothe egos, to build alliances, to be the velvet glove on the family's iron fist. Because all of this, the keys, the herbs, the needle, the letters, was all preparation for her ultimate purpose. Arthur was being trained to fight for his family's name. Eleanor was being trained to be traded for it. Her entire upbringing was, in essence, an audition. She was being polished and perfected for the dynastic marriage market. Every skill she acquired increased her value. A girl who could manage a large household was a prize. One who was pious and demure was a credit to her lineage. One who could navigate courtly society with grace was a strategic asset. From the moment she arrived at her foster home, she was being watched and assessed. Messengers and gossips carried reports of her progress, her looks, her temperament. She was being groomed for a transaction, one in which she was the principal commodity. The choice of her husband would have nothing to do with love, compatibility, or personal happiness. It would be a cold calculation of land, power, and influence. Her womb was not her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of two bloodlines. Her life's great work would be to produce a male heir, securing the alliance her father had made. To fail in this was the greatest disaster imaginable. As Arthur reached the age of 14, his life changed again. If he had proven himself worthy, he was elevated from page to squire. This was a significant step up. He was no longer a general household servant. He was now assigned to a specific knight, becoming his personal attendant, his apprentice, his shadow. The word squire comes from the French écuyer, meaning shield-bearer, and that was his most literal job. But it was so much more. He was now responsible for a warrior's life. He woke before his knight, tending to the horses, a knight's warhorse. His destrier was a priceless beast, the medieval equivalent of a fighter jet, and had to be cared for with meticulous attention. He was responsible for his knight's armour. This was not a simple task. A full suit of plate armour could have over 100 individual pieces, all of which had to be kept clean, free of rust and perfectly maintained. He learned to recognise the specific squeak of a rivet that needed tightening, the particular way a strap should be buckled for maximum flexibility and protection. He would spend hours polishing the steel until it shone, not for vanity, but because a smooth, glancing surface could deflect a fatal blow. He dressed his knight for battle, a complex ritual that could take the better part of an hour. He knew the order of every piece, from the padded gambeson to the mail hauberk, to the final plate components. He was the pit crew and the mechanic, all in one. In battle, his job was terrifying. He did not fight in the front line at first. He stayed close behind his knight, carrying spare weapons and a shield. If his knight's lance shattered, the squire had to be there instantly with a sword or a mace. If the knight was unhorsed, a catastrophic event, it was the squire's duty to protect him on the ground, help him to his feet, or get him to safety. This required a profound intimacy and trust. The knight's life was literally in his squire's hands. He was a breath away from the carnage, close enough to smell the blood and hear the screams, learning the brutal reality of war firsthand. His training intensified. He now fought with real weapons, practicing in the tilt yard against other squires. The tourney culture was at its height, a combination of deadly sport and social spectacle. Here a squire could begin to make a name for himself, showing his prowess before an audience of lords and ladies. It was his chance to prove he was ready. And then, if he survived, if he proved his valour and his skill, came the culmination of his entire youth, the knighting ceremony. This was a profound, deeply symbolic moment. It often began the night before, with a ritual bath of purification. Then the squire-to-be would spend the entire night in a vigil, kneeling in prayer before the altar in the chapel, his armour laid out before him. It was a moment of quiet contemplation, a spiritual and mental preparation for the vows he was about to take. The next day, in a public ceremony, he would be dressed in symbolic colours, white for purity, red for the blood he was willing to shed, and he would kneel before his lord. He would swear the oaths of chivalry, to protect the weak, to defend the church, to be loyal to his lord, to uphold justice. Then the lord would tap him on the shoulder with the flat of a sword, the accolade, and speak the words, "Arise, Sir Knight." In that moment, Arthur ceased to be a boy. He was now a full-fledged member of the warrior elite, a man of power and privilege, forged in a crucible of service, discipline and violence that had lasted for 14 years. He had successfully navigated the path laid out for him. He was the finished product. Eleanor, meanwhile, had no such public ceremony. Her graduation, her knighting, was her wedding day. There was no vigil, no sworn oath to a higher ideal, only a vow to a man she likely barely knew. As she approached her mid-teens, negotiations for her marriage, which had probably been going on in the background for years, would intensify. She might be trotted out at feasts and tournaments, to be inspected by potential suitors or their representatives. It's as uncomfortable as it sounds. Her looks, her posture, her manners, everything was under scrutiny. Her wedding day was the moment her value was officially transferred from one house to another. She would be dressed in the finest fabrics her family could afford, a walking symbol of their wealth and status. The ceremony was a public and religious confirmation of a property deal, and then, often that very day, she would leave her foster home, and perhaps even her birth family, forever. She would journey to her husband's lands, to a new castle, where she was now the lady. All that training, all those years learning her keys and her herbs, were now put to the test. She was no longer the apprentice, she was the mistress. She had to win the respect of a whole new staff of servants, navigate the politics of her husband's court, and immediately begin the most important task of all, producing an heir. The pressure was immediate and absolute. A barren wife could be set aside, repudiated, her life ruined. Her entire value, so carefully cultivated for 16 years, rested on her ability to conceive, and preferably to bear a son. There was no room for error, for either of them. The gilded cage had high walls and a comfortable floor, but it was a cage nonetheless. The bars were forged from duty, lineage and expectation. For the vast majority of peasant children, life was a struggle for physical survival against the harsh realities of nature. For the children of the nobility, life was a struggle for identity against the overwhelming weight of their own name. They were given everything except perhaps the one thing any child truly needs, the freedom to be themselves. Their childhood was a performance, their education a rehearsal, and their adult life the long demanding show they were born to play. They had crossed the threshold from that slammed door of childhood, not into a world of opportunity, but into a different, more ornate, and perhaps even more unforgiving room, where the walls were hung with tapestries and the air was thick with the silent, crushing demands of the past. Chapter 8. The Forgotten, Orphans, Foundlings and Children of the Poor. But for every child trapped in that ornate room, a prisoner of tapestries and expectations, there were thousands upon thousands more who stood outside in the cold. They weren't just in a different room, they were in a different world entirely. They stood on the wrong side of the door, on the wrong side of the wall, and for them, the crushing demands of the past were replaced by the far more immediate and brutal demands of the present. They are the ghosts in the margins of our history books, the footnotes to the grand sagas of kings and knights. These are the forgotten children of the Middle Ages, and their story, though quiet and often unwritten, is one of the most profound testaments to human survival. For these children, the concept of a childhood, even the rigid, structured one of a noble, was a luxury beyond imagining. Their world was not defined by tutors and chaperones, but by the stark, simple arithmetic of existence. It was a world stripped of all padding, all insulation, where the raw edges of life were felt from the very beginning. And in this world, the most precarious position of all was that of the orphan. Losing one or both parents in the medieval period was not a tragic anomaly. It was a depressingly common feature of life. Disease, famine, childbirth, a simple farming accident. The threads holding a family together were frighteningly thin. For a child, the snapping of those threads meant an immediate and terrifying plunge into uncertainty. Their future now hinged not on a grand strategy of marriage alliances, but on a patchwork of luck, obligation, and the occasional flicker of human kindness. The first and perhaps best hope for an orphan was the web of kinship. In a world without formal social services, the family was everything. An uncle, an aunt, a grandparent, or even a cousin might step in. This wasn't always born of pure altruism, though surely that existed. It was also a matter of social duty, of maintaining the family's honour and standing within the village. To let a kinsman's child starve in the lane would bring shame upon the entire family. But it was also a deeply practical arrangement. A growing child, especially a boy, was another pair of hands. He could be put to work in the fields, tend the animals, learn a trade. A girl could help with the endless domestic chores, spinning, cooking, mending, minding younger children. The orphan wasn't adopted in the modern sense. They were absorbed. They became another mouth to feed. Yes, but also another body to contribute to the family's precarious economy. For the child, this could be a lifeline. They would have a roof, however leaky, over their head, and a share of the pottage, however thin. But it was rarely a life of equality. They were often the last to be fed, the first to be blamed, the one given the oldest, most patched-up clothes. They were acutely aware of their dependent status. They were the cousin, the nephew, the charge, a constant reminder of a family broken. The psychological weight of this must have been immense. Every bite of bread was a gift, every patched tunic a loan against future labour. They learned early to make themselves useful, to be quiet, to not cause trouble. Their survival depended on not being a burden, a lesson that would shape their entire being. Imagine a child who knows, deep in their bones, that their very existence is contingent on the goodwill of relatives who have their own hungry mouths to feed. It's a childhood spent walking on eggshells, where the line between belonging and being cast out is perilously thin. If the family network failed, or simply didn't exist, the next line of defence was the community itself, often embodied by the village priest or the local lord. The parish had a vested interest in not having starving, desperate children turning to crime on its doorstep. A kindly priest might arrange for a family to take the child in, with the parish perhaps offering a small stipend of grain or a few pennies to ease the burden. The lord of the manor, in a gesture of what was called noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility, might do the same. This was both a pious act, good for the soul, and a practical one, good for the estate. An orphan fostered with a tenant family would, in time, become another loyal worker on the Lord's land. But for orphans in the growing towns and cities, a different path might open up. The guild, the powerful craft guilds, the weavers, the masons, the goldsmiths, were more than just trade organisations. They were complex social structures, brotherhoods that provided a cradle-to-grave support system for their members, and that support sometimes extended to the children of members who had passed away. A guild would often use its funds to place an orphan as an apprentice with a master craftsman. This was, on the surface, a golden ticket. An apprenticeship was the primary route to a skilled trade, a secure profession, and a life of relative stability. It promised a future. The contract would be drawn up, a formal document binding the child to the master for a set number of years, often 7, but sometimes more. The master would agree to provide food, shelter, clothing, and most importantly, to teach the child the art and mystery of his craft. In return, the child provided their labour, entirely unpaid, for the duration of the term. For the orphan, the master's workshop became their new home, the master their new father figure. But this new father could be a harsh and demanding one. The life of an apprentice was notoriously difficult. The days were long, starting before sunrise and ending long after sunset. The work was often menial and exhausting, especially in the early years. They were the ones sweeping the floors, running errands, tending the fire, and performing the most repetitive, mind-numbing tasks. They were at the absolute bottom of the workshop hierarchy, subject to the whims and discipline of the master, his wife, and even the older journeyman. Beatings were a common and accepted form of correction. The food could be meagre, the sleeping arrangements rough, often just a straw pallet in a corner of the workshop or a cold attic. Yet, amid the drudgery, they were learning. They were absorbing the secret language of the craft, the feel of the tools, the rhythm of the work. A stonemason's apprentice learned the difference between limestone and granite by touch. A weaver's apprentice learned to distinguish threads by their tension. A baker's apprentice learned the exact moment dough was ready by its smell and feel. They were slowly, painstakingly building a future for themselves, one scraped knuckle and aching back at a time. The guild offered them something precious and rare, a path from nothing to something. An orphan who completed their apprenticeship could become a journeyman, travel and hone their skills, and one day perhaps become a master in their own right, with a workshop and apprentices of their own. They could transcend the tragedy of their birth and forge a new identity, one built not on lineage but on skill. The other great institution that sometimes offered sanctuary was the church. Monasteries and nunneries were pillars of medieval society, and part of their pious duty was charity. Some, though not all, would take in orphaned children. For a boy, this might mean being raised within the monastery walls as an oblate. He would be educated, taught to read and write Latin, to sing in the choir, and to understand the scriptures. He would trade a life of manual labour in the fields for a life of prayer and scholarship. It was a world of quiet routine, of bells chiming the hours for prayer, of cold stone corridors, and the smell of incense and old parchment. He would be fed, clothed, and kept safe from the harshness of the outside world. But this safety came at a price, the forfeiture of choice. An oblate was given to God, and it was generally expected that he would take vows and become a monk when he came of age. His life path was chosen for him. While it was a life of peace and security, it was also one of confinement. He would likely never marry, never have a family of his own, never know the world beyond the monastery's high walls. For some, this was a blessed release from a life of poverty. For others, it must have felt like a gilded cage. For girls, the options were similar but more limited. A nunnery might take in an orphan, raising her to a life of devotion. She would learn spinning, weaving and embroidery, skills valuable to the convent, and she would be taught her prayers. Like the oblate, her future was largely predetermined. The convent was her world, the other nuns her family. It was a life of profound security and spiritual purpose, but it was not a life of freedom. These systems, kinship, community, guild and church, formed a fragile, imperfect safety net. It was a net with many holes, and many children slipped through, but it was a net nonetheless, woven from threads of duty, piety, and practicality. It demonstrates a society grappling with a constant problem, using the institutions it had to try and care for its most vulnerable. For an orphan who was caught by this net, life would be hard, but it would be a life. They had a place, a function, a path forward. But what of the children for whom there was no net? The children who were not simply orphaned but abandoned. These were the foundlings, the infants left in the dead of night, wrapped in a thin blanket and placed on the cold stone steps of a church or a monastery. This was the ultimate act of desperation. We can only imagine the mother, her heart breaking, choosing this last desperate gamble in the hope that her child might live a life she could not provide. Perhaps she was a servant girl, seduced and abandoned. Perhaps she was a wife whose husband had died, leaving her with a newborn she couldn't possibly feed. Perhaps the child was illegitimate, a product of a secret affair whose existence threatened scandal and ruin. Whatever the reason, the act was a plea to God and to the community. Leaving a child at the church door was not necessarily an act of heartless abandonment. It was an act of surrender. It was placing the infant quite literally in the hands of the church. The hope was that the first person to open the doors for morning prayers, a priest, a monk, a devout parishioner, would find the child and take pity. It was a terrible silent lottery. The child's survival depended on the weather, on being found before freezing or starving, on the kindness of a stranger. When a foundling was discovered, a process, informal as it was, would begin. The child would be brought inside, warmed by a fire, and baptized immediately, securing its immortal soul, which was of paramount importance. The parish would then take on the responsibility for the child. But a church is not equipped to care for an infant, so the most common solution was to find a wet nurse, a local woman, often a poor peasant who had recently had a child of her own and was still lactating, would be paid a small fee by the parish to nurse and care for the foundling. This system, born of necessity, was fraught with danger for the infant. The wet nurse was often desperately poor herself. Her own children were her priority. The parish fee was meagre, and sometimes paid irregularly. The foundling in her care was an extra mouth to feed, and a constant burden. While many wet nurses were surely kind and caring, the conditions were often grim. Neglect was common, not always out of cruelty, but out of the sheer grinding exhaustion of poverty. The mortality rate for these parish-supported foundlings was terrifyingly high. They were the most fragile of lives, passed from a desperate mother to an overwhelmed stranger, their fate hanging by the thinnest of threads. If a foundling managed to survive infancy, their path looked much like that of an orphan. They were a child of the parish, and the parish would seek to place them in a situation where they were no longer a financial drain. They would be fostered out to a family, apprenticed to a craftsman, or perhaps given to a monastery. They grew up with the heavy stigma of their origins. They had no family name, no known lineage. Their very existence was a question mark. In a society where family and kinship were the bedrock of identity, to be a foundling was to be a ghost. They belonged to no one. They were often called by the name of the saint on whose feast day they were found, or the name of the church where they were left. Their identity was a label given by strangers. Theirs was a life of profound psychological challenges. They had to navigate a world that constantly, subtly reminded them of their otherness. They were the charity case, the parish child. This could breed a fierce resilience, a determination to prove their worth and build a life for themselves from scratch, or it could create a deep and abiding sense of shame and alienation. They were living proof of someone else's transgression, a walking secret. And this brings us to the children who were not abandoned, but who lived with the secret of their birth every day, the illegitimate. To be born outside of wedlock in the Middle Ages was to be branded. The Church's teachings on marriage and legitimacy were absolute. A child born of a union not sanctified by God was seen as a product of sin, and that stain, however unfairly, clung to the child. The term bastard was not just an insult, it was a legal and social category. The consequences of this status varied enormously, depending almost entirely on the station of the parents, particularly the father. For the illegitimate child of a powerful noble or a king, the situation was complex but not necessarily hopeless. These children were often acknowledged, raised in the noble household, though always in a subordinate position to their legitimate half-siblings. They would be educated, trained in arms or courtly manners, and provided for. They could not, under normal circumstances, inherit their father's title or lands. That was the unbreachable firewall of legitimacy. The entire system of aristocratic lineage, property, and power depended on it. However, a powerful father could do much for his illegitimate offspring. He could grant them lesser titles, gift them estates, or arrange advantageous marriages for them with other, perhaps lower-ranking noble families. He could secure them powerful positions in the church, where the vow of celibacy made their inability to produce legitimate heirs irrelevant. An ambitious and capable illegitimate son could become a famous knight, a respected commander, or a wealthy bishop. Think of William the Conqueror himself, who was known to his enemies as William the Bastard. His status was a constant challenge, a goad that arguably fueled his ferocious ambition to seize a crown and forge a legitimacy of his own through conquest. These high-status children lived in a world of ambiguity, of privilege mixed with exclusion. They were at the feast, but not at the head of the table. But for the vast, overwhelming majority, illegitimacy was not a story of ambitious conquest. It was a story of quiet shame and limited horizons. The illegitimate child of a peasant girl and a travelling soldier, or a merchant and his serving maid, faced a much grimmer reality. They were often raised by their single mother, who herself would be socially shunned. The family would be marked by the scandal. The child would grow up hearing the whispers in the village, seeing the averted gazes. They carried their mother's shame as their own. Legally, they had few rights. They had no claim on their father's property or name. They might be denied entry into certain guilds. Their path in life was narrowed from the start. They learned to live with the stigma, to expect less, to be overlooked. Their existence was a constant reminder of a broken rule in a society built on rules. The emotional toll of this, the feeling of being inherently flawed or less than, is impossible to quantify, but must have been a heavy burden to carry through life. And yet these children, the orphan, the foundling, the illegitimate, were, in a strange way, the lucky ones. They were at least on the radar of society's institutions. Their existence was acknowledged, even if as a problem to be solved. There was a final group, a vast multitude of children, who existed almost entirely below this radar. They were not technically orphans, and their parentage was not in question. They were simply the children of the utterly crushingly poor. For these children, there was no transition from infancy to childhood. There was only a transition from being carried to being put to work. From the moment they could walk and follow a simple instruction, their lives were about contributing to the family's desperate struggle for survival. There was no room for play, no concept of education, no time for the luxury of being a child. Their childhood was a myth. Their life was work. Imagine a 5-year-old sent out into the fields from sunrise to sunset. His job is to be a bird scarer. All day long, he walks the newly sown furrows, shouting, clapping his hands, throwing small stones, anything to keep the crows and pigeons from eating the precious seeds that represent the family's hope for the next harvest. It is lonely, boring, and exposed work. He is out in the sun, the wind, the rain. His world is the size of that single field. Or imagine a little girl of 6, whose days are spent gathering firewood. She wanders the common lands and the edges of the Lord's forest, a sack slung over her small shoulder, picking up every fallen twig, every dry branch. It is back-breaking work. She has to be careful not to trespass on the Lord's protected woodland, where taking wood could result in a severe beating, or a fine her family could never pay. She learns to read the landscape, not for its beauty, but for its resources. That gnarled root might burn for an hour. That patch of dry bracken is good for starting a fire. Other children were set to work tending the family's single pig, or a few geese, guiding them to common grazing land, and then back home again, making sure they didn't wander off or get stolen. They would spend their days in the company of animals, their minds occupied with the simple, vital task of protecting the family's most valuable assets. These children weren't just helping out with chores after a day of play. The chores were their day. As they grew older, the work became harder. A boy of 7 or 8 would be expected to help his father with the ploughing, guiding the ox or breaking up clods of earth with a mallet. A girl would learn to spin wool, her small fingers working the spindle for hours on end, turning raw fleece into the thread that could be woven into cloth to keep the family warm, or sold at market for a few precious coins. Their bodies were shaped by this labour. They had the stooped shoulders of field workers, the calloused hands of labourers, the weathered faces of people who had spent their lives outdoors, long before they had even reached adolescence. Their world was profoundly sensory, but not in a pleasant way. It was the constant, gnawing ache of hunger in their bellies. It was the biting cold that seeped through their thin, ragged clothes in winter. It was the stench of the manure pile, the sweat of the animals, and the unwashed bodies crowded into their small, dark, smoky hut at night. It was the rough scratch of the straw they slept on, a bed they often shared not only with their parents and siblings, but also with the family's livestock, brought inside during the coldest months for their precious warmth and for their protection. If you think your bedroom is crowded, imagine trying to sleep while a cow is placidly chewing its cud 2 feet from your head. For these children, the world was a place of immense danger that we can barely comprehend. A simple cut from a scythe could lead to a fatal infection. A fall from a tree while gathering apples could mean a broken bone that would never heal properly, leaving them crippled for life. They were vulnerable to disease, malnutrition, and the casual cruelty of a world that had little time for the weak. They saw death up close, as a regular and unremarkable event. They would have seen siblings sicken and die, neighbours succumb to famine or plague. Life was cheap, and they knew it. In the cities, the poverty was different, but no less severe. The children of the urban poor lived in crowded, filthy tenements. They might work alongside their parents in a noxious trade, like tanning, their small hands useful for detailed work, or they might be cast out onto the streets to fend for themselves. The medieval city was a chaotic, dangerous organism, and these children learned to navigate its arteries and alleys. They became beggars, their faces and bodies artfully arranged to elicit pity and a coin. They learned which church doors were the most profitable, which pilgrims were the most generous. They formed gangs, packs of feral children who survived through petty theft, a loaf of bread from a baker's stall, a purse cut from a merchant's belt. It was a life of constant vigilance and brutal competition. They were old before they were young, their faces etched with a cunning and weariness that belonged to someone 4 times their age. This was the reality for the overwhelming majority of children in the Middle Ages, not the structured existence of the nobility, or even the difficult but defined path of a guild apprentice. It was a life reduced to its absolute basics, the struggle for food, warmth, and shelter, a struggle that began the day they were born, and did not end until the day they died. They were not seen as children in our sense of the word. They were miniature adults, economic units whose value was measured in the labour they could provide. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's easy to be captivated by the castles, the cathedrals, the knights in shining armour, but those are just the peaks of a vast submerged landscape. The true foundation of that world was built by the calloused hands and aching backs of people whose names we will never know, and a huge portion of that labour was done by children. They were the bird scarers, the wood gatherers, the spinners, the beggars. They were the forgotten engine of the medieval world. Their lives are a powerful, and perhaps uncomfortable, corrective to our modern nostalgia. They remind us that for most of human history, childhood as we understand it, a protected, nurtured space for growth and development, simply did not exist. It is a modern invention, a fragile and precious creation. The children of the medieval poor knew nothing of it. Their horizon was limited to the next meal, the coming winter, the hope of surviving one more year. And yet, it would be a mistake to see their lives as nothing but bleak, colourless misery. Within this brutal framework, there must have been moments of joy, a rare feast day with extra food, a travelling fair with jugglers and music, the simple pleasure of a warm summer's day after a long, cold winter, a story told by the fire, a roughly carved wooden toy. These moments of light must have shone all the brighter for the darkness surrounding them. Children possess a remarkable resilience, an ability to find joy and play in the most unpromising of circumstances. A game of tag in the village green, a competition to see who could find the most interesting shaped stone. These small, unrecorded acts of being a child surely happened, but these flickers of light do not change the fundamental nature of their existence. They were born into a world that demanded everything from them, and promised them almost nothing in return. They inherited a life of relentless toil, and their greatest hope was simply to endure it long enough to pass it on to their own children. Theirs is not a story of grand achievements or dramatic reversals of fortune. It is a story of quiet, stubborn, anonymous survival. It's the story of the human spirit stripped down to its core, facing a world of profound indifference and somehow, against all odds, continuing. As we leave them, these forgotten children, it's worth remembering that they are not just historical curiosities. They are the vast, silent majority of our ancestors. Their resilience is written into our DNA. Their struggles paved the foundation of the world we now inhabit, a world where the idea of protecting a child's right to be a child is, at least, an ideal we strive for. Their lost childhoods are the dark soil from which our modern concept of childhood grew, and in remembering them we pay tribute to the millions of small, anonymous lives that carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, so that one day their distant descendants might finally have the chance to set it down